Sometimes the quietest lives hold entire cities inside them. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man whose hands once held the rhythm of an entire place. Long before most people ever thought about trams, long before electric bells or polished steel rails. This is the story of one of the very first tram drivers in Tallinn, a man who spent his life guiding a wooden carriage through a city still learning what movement could feel like. If you enjoy calm, forgotten stories like this one, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps these quiet lives stay alive a little longer in a world that moves too fast to notice them. Tallinn, early 20th century. A city caught between centuries. One foot in the old world of horse hooves and lantern light, the other reaching toward wires, tracks, and the hum of something new. The streets were narrow, uneven, shaped by centuries of merchants, fishermen, soldiers, and wandering feet. Wooden houses leaned slightly toward each other, as if trying to share warmth in the long Baltic winters. Church towers rose above the rooftops, their bells marking each hour with a steady calm. And the air, depending on the season, smelled either of sea salt, burning peat, or freshly baked rye bread carried from market stalls. Before the tram, Tallinn moved at the pace of people. You could feel the weight of time in every step. But then came the rails, shining strips of metal laid down like a promise. People gathered to watch the workers hammer them into the cobblestones. Some were skeptical, others laughed. A few whispered that machines were replacing the old ways too quickly. But most simply stood in the cold morning light, waiting for the sound they had never heard before. The first tram ringing through the city. And guiding that first shivering carriage was a quiet man named Alvar Kivi. He was not famous, not photographed at inaugurations, not written about in newspapers. Even in his own time, he was known simply as the driver, as though the city had only one. He had the calm presence of someone who understood machines before he ever touched one. Tall, with narrow shoulders and a face softened by the cold, Alvar looked like someone carved from the same stone as the city's old walls. A little weathered, a little tired, but steady. He lived in a small room near the depot, in a wooden building that creaked in the wind. From his window he could see the rails glinting faintly in the early morning frost. Some mornings he woke before dawn and simply watched the way the lamps reflected on the metal, like tiny beads of amber. To him, those rails were not just a route. They were a pulse, a line that connected the heartbeat of the old city to the one slowly growing around it. Driving a tram was nothing like the work he had done before. As a boy, he had helped fishermen mend nets. Later, he carried sacks of grain in the harbour, learning how to balance weight on unsteady planks. But when the tram arrived, something inside him felt called to it, not by excitement, but by a quiet understanding. Machines did not shout, did not hurry, did not judge. They simply waited for someone to guide them. And guiding was something he knew how to do. On the day he first touched the wooden throttle of Tallinn's early tram, the world felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just slightly more awake. The tram was small, still smelling of fresh varnish and iron. Its wheels were stiff on the frozen rails, unsure of their new home. And behind Alvar, a handful of passengers sat quietly, unfamiliar with the idea of being carried anywhere faster than walking pace. When he pulled the lever for the first time, the tram trembled like a living thing. The vibration rose through the floorboards, into his boots, and up his spine. It was not a machine's shiver. It was more like breath, the first inhalation of something that knew it was meant to move. People on the street stopped to watch. Children pointed. Horses snorted nervously. A few old men shook their heads, claiming nothing good ever came from things that moved without hooves. But the tram rolled on, slow and determined, as if learning the city with each meter. For Alvar, that first journey became something he would remember for the rest of his life. The city unfolded in front of him like a map he had walked 1,000 times. But now it felt different, closer, quieter, more intimate. Each corner held a memory, each turn a story. And through the windows of the tram, Tallinn looked as though it were exhaling after a long, slow breath. He guided the tram up gentle slopes where snow collected in soft layers, past bakeries that opened before sunrise, past market squares where vendors set up stalls with stiff fingers. He rang the bell for the first time near Viru Gate, its bright chime echoing along the stone walls. And when the tram finally pulled into its final stop, the passengers stepped out in silence, not because they were unimpressed, but because they sensed they had witnessed something small and historic. That night, when the tram returned to the depot, Alvar stayed longer than necessary. He walked around the wooden carriage, inspecting bolts, touching the rails, listening to the faint ticking sounds of iron cooling after a long day. The depot was large and shadowed, filled with the scent of oil and damp wood. It felt alive, even then, as if the walls held their breath alongside the machine. And in that dim light, Alvar realized something quietly profound. This tram was no longer just a job. It was becoming a companion. He felt its weight, its warmth, its tired sighs. He learned when the wheels needed oiling by the way they hummed on the track. He began to sense the difference between a smooth turn and one that needed attention. And slowly, as days turned into months, the tram began to take on a voice, soft, metallic, familiar. Tallinn was changing. His life was changing. And though the future held wires, electricity, and faster machines, this moment, the first breath of a wooden tram on iron rails, belonged entirely to him. He did not know it yet, but he would spend decades listening to the heartbeat of the lines beneath him. He would become the quiet guardian of a route that the city would one day forget. And he would be the last person in Tallinn who truly remembered how a tram sounded when it was still learning how to breathe. Tallinn, in those early years of the 20th century, was a city caught somewhere between centuries, as if unsure which world truly belonged to it. The old stones of the medieval walls still held the memory of merchants and knights, while new wires and steel rails stretched across the streets like delicate threads of an uncertain future. It was a place where the past and the present walked side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, always in quiet conversation. Mornings began slowly in this city. The Baltic air had a weight to it, a cool presence that slid between wooden houses and curled around chimneys. Before the sun rose fully, a thin mist drifted across the cobblestones, softening the hard edges of the world. Lantern posts stood like tired sentinels along the streets, their glass panes still fogged from the night. And somewhere, always, the faint smell of the sea found its way inland, carrying hints of salt, damp rope, and cold iron from the harbour. Tallinn was not a large city then, but it was layered. Old German stone, Estonian wood, Russian administration, Swedish echoes, and the voices of fishermen whose families had lived by the water for generations. The old town stood proud on its hill, its towers rising like watchful eyes over the rest of the streets. Their bells marked the hours with slow, patient tolls that drifted across rooftops. Below, the newer district spread outward with quieter colours, their buildings simpler, their roads broader but still uneven. In winter, the cold arrived like a ruler returning to reclaim land. Icy winds from the Gulf of Finland scraped along the streets, rattling shutters and leaving frost on every window. But even then, the city had its warmth. Bakeries from Kalamaja sent out the smell of dark rye bread. The markets offered herring, smoked fish, and steaming porridge. And in the early mornings, horses exhaled clouds of white breath as they pulled carts through the slush. Before the tram, the rhythm of the city was determined by footsteps and hooves. People walked slowly, talked quietly, worked steadily. There was no rush, only a continuous flow of days shaped by the weather, the sea, and the trades people depended on. Markets opened just after dawn. Fishermen hauled in their nets long before that. Children carried firewood home, their small boots leaving sharp prints in the frost. And the bells, always the bells, guided the hours like a gentle, unbroken thread. The introduction of the tram was not simply a technological change. It was a shift in the heartbeat of Tallinn. Rails were laid with care through the central streets, their gleaming surfaces cutting clean lines across the cobblestones. People watched from doorways and windows as workers hammered the metal into place. Some were excited, others suspicious. Many afraid that the old way of life, slow, grounded, predictable, might be slipping away. Tallinn had always been a city of contrasts. Fishermen and merchants, craftsmen and officials, rich and poor living, close enough to hear each other's footsteps. In the mornings, wealthy families hired carriages that rolled slowly along Pick Street, their wheels clattering confidently. But only a few streets away, working men walked to factories with wool scarves wrapped tightly around their necks, their breaths rising in small clouds. The tram line stitched these worlds together. It crossed districts that rarely mixed before. The harbour near Kalamaja, the stone towers near the old town gates, the broad, quieter areas near Kadriorg. It was as if the tram took the scattered pieces of Tallinn and threaded them onto a single track. And for those first few years, the city seemed unsure how to respond. Some mornings, when the mist hung thick, the rails glistened like fresh ink. Children would run their fingers along them, fascinated by the cold smoothness. Elderly men would shake their heads and mutter that nothing good came from machines that moved too fast. Women in wool coats paused to listen as the tram rolled by for the first time, its bell chiming brightly in the foggy air. Tallinn was changing, but not quickly. Change came here the way the sun rose, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the city realized it had already happened. Alvar felt this deeply. As one of the first tram drivers, he sensed the city shifting under his hands. The cobblestones that once belonged only to footsteps now echoed with the rhythmic click and hum of wheels. The quiet mornings he had known as a dock worker now pulsed with mechanical life. He often stood at the depot's entrance before the day began and listened. The distant gulls, the faint calling of vendors, the soft murmur of the tram warming in the cold. It was a new kind of morning song. The people of Tallinn reacted in their own ways. Children adored the tram first. They ran after it, laughed at its bell, waved at the driver as if he was steering a parade float. Some adults warmed to it gradually, appreciating the speed and comfort. Others remained wistful, remembering a time when the city moved at the pace of their own footsteps. Tallinn was not yet electrified. Lights still came from lamps, fires, candles. At dusk, lamplighters walked through the streets with long poles, greeting each lantern with a small circle of flame. Their glow reflected on the rails, making them look almost alive, a golden path stretching into the cool evening. The tram rolled through these glowing streets like a soft interruption, a reminder that the world was changing, even as the lamps still flickered in the wind. In summer, the city softened. Warm breezes carried the scent of pine and wildflowers from the outskirts. Markets overflowed with berries and vegetables. The tram moved slowly through sunlit streets, its windows open, warm air drifting through the wooden interior. People smiled more. Musicians played near the gates. Children sold small bouquets of flowers to passengers who stepped off the tram at the main square. In autumn, Tallinn turned gold. Leaves gathered in piles along the tracks. The tram brushed through them, its wheels creating gentle rustles. The city grew quieter, preparing for winter. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, straight lines. And each evening, the sky turned a deep copper color that reflected on the rails like melted metal. Through all these changing seasons, Alvar learned the language of the city, not through books or maps, but through movement. He felt its cobblestones, its hills, its turns. He memorized the way the tram shifted weight when rounding a bend or climbing a slope. He knew where the rails hummed softly and where they groaned. And slowly, he understood something that many never did, that a city is alive, and the ones who guide its movement learn its heartbeat better than anyone. Tallinn in those years was still small, still intimate, still touched by the hands of everyone who lived there. And as the tram glided through its streets for the very first times, the city seemed to inhale, cautious, curious, hopeful. It was a place suspended between centuries, but for Alvar, it felt like he was driving through time itself, carrying the old world into the new one, day by day, stop by stop, rail by shining rail. The tram that would become Alvar's world did not look extraordinary to anyone else. It was simply tram number 12, a wooden-bodied carriage with narrow windows, a small bell, and an engine that sometimes coughed like an old smoker finding his breath. But to Alvar, this tram had a personality from the very first moment he touched its worn wooden railings. It wasn't new, not even then. The varnish had faded in places where countless hands had gripped the edges. The brass handles bore tiny scratches, each one a memory left by strangers. And the wheels, though sturdy, carried the faint, rhythmic groan of metal that had already learned the city's uneven streets. In the mornings, Tram 12 waited inside the depot like an animal not yet fully awake. Its wooden walls felt cold to the touch. The glass of its lamps held the night's chill. When Alvar stepped into the cabin each day, he always paused for a moment before starting anything. He believed the tram, like a living creature, needed to be acknowledged, not with words, but with presence. His hand brushing gently over the controls, the way one might settle a horse before a long day. No one taught him this. It simply felt right. The cabin was small, barely enough space for one man to stand comfortably. The wooden floor creaked under his boots. The levers and brakes were arranged in a narrow arc, each one with its own weight and resistance. Alvar learned them faster than anyone expected, not by force or study, but by listening. The tram responded to gentle movements. It disliked sudden changes. If he pulled too sharply on the throttle, the wheels protested with a metallic shriek. If he braked too quickly, Passengers lurched forward and muttered disapproval. But when he moved with patience, with rhythm, the tram slid along the rails like a boat gliding over calm water. Colour lingered everywhere inside Tram 12. The paint, once a deep forest green, had softened into muted olive. Sunlight, when it entered through the windows, turned the interior golden, catching dust that danced in slow, swirling spirals. The window frames were slightly crooked, and one pane had a tiny crack shaped like a branching river. Alvar loved that crack. It reminded him of the fractals of thin ice forming on puddles in early winter. But what he cherished most was the sound. Tram 12 had a voice. It hummed on straight stretches of road, a low and steady vibration that travelled through Alvar's hands into his arms. It sighed softly when climbing a gentle hill, as if gathering strength. On sharp turns, it produced a brief, high-pitched note, like a violin string being touched lightly. And when Alvar applied the brake smoothly enough, the tram let out a quiet, settling sound, the exhale of something that knew it was safe. Other drivers joked that Alvar treated the tram like a pet. They teased him for polishing the metal parts himself or wiping dust off the dashboard, even when no one else would use it. But Alvar didn't mind. They didn't understand the simple truth. If you give attention to a machine, it gives you trust in return. He felt the tram respond to him, as if recognizing his hands, his rhythm, his way of guiding it through the city. Tram 12 had its quirks too, flaws that might have frustrated another driver, but that Alvar found almost endearing. The second bench from the back always squeaked when someone heavy sat on it. One of the side panels rattled during strong winds. The bells sometimes hesitated before ringing, requiring a gentle tap with his thumb. And when the weather grew cold enough, the windows fogged so quickly that Alvar carried a small cloth specifically to wipe the glass between stops. There was also the lantern. In those early years, electric lights had not yet replaced the old lamps inside the tram. A small oil lantern hung near the driver's cabin, flickering gently with each jolt of the rails. Its warm glow softened the shadows inside and gave the interior the atmosphere of a travelling room, part machine, part shelter. At dusk, when passengers boarded with their scarves and chilly fingers, the lantern turned the space into something almost intimate. Every tram had a route. Every route had a soul. Tram 12's soul was made of contrasts. It began near the seaside, where the wind carried salt and gull cries. From there, it turned into narrow residential streets where old women swept their doorways every morning. It passed by the market, where vendors called out prices for fish and apples. It crossed the main square, echoing beneath the clock tower. And then it climbed gently toward Kadriorg, where tall trees framed the tracks like a quiet tunnel. The tram's wheels learned these textures, the smooth stone of the square, the uneven cobbles near the harbour, the sandy grit blown in from the coast. Alvar felt each one in his hands, as though the tram were telling him where it was, how it moved, what the day wanted from it. Passengers rarely noticed the subtleties. To them, the tram was a convenience, a way to cross the city without tiring their legs. But to Alvar, the tracks were like lines of a story he reread every day. He recognized regulars the way one recognizes recurring characters in a book. The baker who boarded at dawn with flour still clinging to his sleeves. The seamstress who rode quietly with pins stuck into her lapel. The factory worker whose boots smelled faintly of smoke and metal. Tram 12 carried their mornings, their worries, their conversations half-whispered under breath. Some passengers nodded politely when entering. Others offered a tired smile. A few never looked up at all. But Alvar observed them with a gentle detachment, not prying, not judging, simply noticing. The way someone clutched their coat tighter on cold days. The way a mother rocked a baby, even when the tram's gentle sway already did half the work. The way elderly men found comfort in the warmth of the lantern and the steady movement beneath their feet. If there was one moment Alvar loved most, it was the early dusk, when the city shifted from day to night. Tram 12 glowed against the evening streets like a slow-moving ember. Shadows lengthened, lamps lit up windows, and people walked home with tired but softened expressions. The bell rang with a mellow tone that echoed between buildings. In those hours, the tram felt almost alive, like a companion helping the city breathe through its daily cycle. Tram 12 had no ambition to be faster or newer. It existed simply to move people gently from one piece of their life to the next. And Alvar felt that purpose in every mile. He learned to guide it with the patience of someone who respects the weight of responsibility, not the weight of cargo, but the weight of moments. People lived their small fragments of life inside his carriage, and he carried those fragments with a care that no one ever saw, but that he always felt. Over time, Alvar began to think of Tram 12, not as a machine, but as a room he lived in. A narrow wooden room that travelled through Tallinn, gathering light, voices, weather, and memory. When he pressed his hand to the side of the tram at night, feeling the vibrations fade into stillness, he felt something close to gratitude. A city could forget its first tram drivers. It could repaint rails, replace engines, electrify tracks. But the memory of Tram 12, the sound of its wheels, the warmth of its lantern, the way it breathed in winter, would always live quietly inside him. And he knew that as long as he drove it, he was not just crossing the city. He was shaping the rhythm of Tallinn itself, one slow wooden journey at a time. Morning in early 20th century Tallinn arrived not with haste, but with a slow unfolding. A grey light stretching itself carefully across rooftops, chimneys releasing their first sleepy breaths of smoke, and the distant hum of a city that had not yet learned the speed of modern life. For Alvar, these early hours were the most honest part of the day, the time when the city whispered instead of spoke, when footsteps were few and every sound seemed to have space around it. He woke before dawn not out of obligation, but because something inside him aligned naturally with the rhythm of the tram. Long before he ever drove one, he had always been an early riser, a habit inherited from years helping fishermen along the harbour, tying knots in cold air, watching the horizon turn from black to pale silver. Now, even though his life had moved from boats to rails, his body remembered that old discipline. His room near the depot was modest, barely larger than the cabin of a small ship. The wooden walls held the lingering scent of peat smoke from neighbouring houses. A small iron stove sat in the corner, its embers from the previous night faintly warm. On the windowsill lay a folded wool scarf, a tin mug, and a small pocket watch with a cracked glass face, a gift from his father, now long gone. The only decoration was a faded photograph of Tallinn's harbour, taken years before he ever touched a tram's controls. When he opened the window, even just a few centimetres, the morning air slid inside like a quiet guest. Cold, damp, carrying the faint smell of salt and chimney soot. The city was not awake yet. Horses shuffled somewhere in the distance. A single gull cried out. The first tram bell had not yet rung. For Alvar, this silence was not emptiness. It was a beginning. He dressed in the same order each morning, a ritual that grounded him. Heavy wool trousers, long shirt, thick knit vest, then his dark coat. The coat was old, but well kept, with buttons polished smoother than they had ever been when new. He pulled on leather gloves still holding the shape of his hands from yesterday's work, and finally wrapped the scarf twice around his neck. Tallinn's mornings demanded warmth, especially near the rails, where the wind moved freely. He stepped outside, boots crunching on frost. The street lamps still burned with soft yellow flames. Electric lighting had reached only a handful of buildings. The lamps cast small circles of warmth on the cobblestones, flickering gently in the breeze. As he walked, the rails shone faintly beneath him, thin silver lines running into the dimness. Approaching the depot always brought a quiet feeling of purpose. In the early 1900s, Tallinn's tram depot was a cavernous wooden structure with tall sliding doors, its interior smelling of oil, cold metal and damp timber. The sound inside was a mixture of echoes and breathing, not human breathing, but the settling creaks of wood, the cooling clicks of engines resting after yesterday's route, and the soft ticking of lanterns hung along the walls. Before most workers arrived, the depot felt like a sleeping animal, and Alvar liked being the one to nudge it gently awake. He pushed open the side door, letting in a thin slice of morning. Inside, the trams stood arranged like a row of quiet sentinels, wooden bodies, iron wheels, brass details catching the faint lantern glow. Some had chipped paint, others bore fresh marks from recent repairs. All of them carried stories of the city etched into their frames. But Alvar walked directly toward Tram 12. He always began the day the same way. He placed his hand on the wooden side of the tram, just below the lantern hook, and let it rest there for a moment. Not out of superstition, but respect. Machines of that era were not silent tools. They were companions, imperfect and honest. And Tram 12, with its uneven hum and stubborn left brake, felt more alive than anything else in his life. He unlocked the cabin door with a small iron key and stepped inside. The interior smelled of oil, worn wood, and something faintly metallic. Overnight, the cold had settled into the seats, into the floor, into the controls themselves. His breath fogged faintly in the air. He set his tin mug on the small shelf near the controls and filled it with tea from the thermos he carried each morning. The scent of black tea rose into the chilly air, mixing with the tram's own smells. Alvar took slow sips, letting the warmth spread through him while his eyes adjusted to the dimness. Then he began the ritual that he never rushed. First, check the lantern. He trimmed the wick with careful precision, struck a match and lit it. The flame flickered warmly, casting trembling gold light across the wooden walls. Long before full electrification, tram cabins depended on these small flames, soft light guiding passengers through winter darkness. Second, inspect the brake line. He crouched beside the controls, feeling along the metal mechanisms for any looseness or roughness. The early trams required attention. If ignored even for a day, the cold and moisture could stiffen them. Third, test the bell. He pressed the brass switch. The bell rang out sharply, its sound skipping through the depot and echoing back with a gentler tone. This was the sound Tallinn had come to recognize. a bright, punctual note announcing motion through the city. Finally, warm the engine. He put his hand on the main lever, feeling the subtle resistance. A soft tremble passed through the wood under his boots as the engine stirred. Not fully awake yet, more like stretching after a long sleep. His favorite moment came then, in that thin space of time when the engine's hum joined the lantern's glow and the tram shifted slightly on its rails as if inhaling. No passengers, no noise, no rush. Just the two of them, a man and a machine, sharing the first breath of the day. Outside, the sky lightened from deep blue to washed-out grey. Workers from the depot began arriving, their silhouettes moving past large windows. Somewhere, a horse snorted. Wheels clattered. A distant church bell announced the hour. But inside Tram 12, the world remained small and steady. Alvar sat in the cabin, gloved hands wrapped around the metal rail. He took another sip of tea, watching steam mingle with the lantern flame. Soon, the doors of the depot would slide open. Soon, the city would climb aboard with its tired faces, bundled coats, and quiet conversations. Soon, he would guide the tram along streets still glistening with frost. But for a few minutes more, the city belonged only to him. He breathed in the cool morning air. The tram hummed faintly beneath him. In these moments, before the world expected anything of him, Alvar felt a kind of peace that nothing else in life had ever given him. Out on the rails, the day waited, and he would carry it gently, just as he always did. The first passengers of the morning were never loud, never hurried, never fully awake. They boarded Tram 12 like shadows slipping into a moving shelter, each carrying a piece of the city's early-hour silence with them. Alvar often thought they were the truest version of Tallinn, the people who lived between night and day, moving before most of the city even opened its windows. The depot doors slid open with a long wooden groan, letting in a gust of cold Baltic air. Alvar guided Tram 12 onto the rails outside, its wheels clattering softly as they found their familiar grooves. The sky was a pale sheet, not yet coloured by sunrise, and the streets stretched out ahead like empty threads waiting to be woven into a day. At the very first stop near the harbour, the morning routine began. The first to board was usually a fisherman. Sometimes Jan, sometimes Peter, sometimes a man he didn't recognize. The harbour was like a tide of faces, always changing but always carrying the same scent. Salt, damp nets and wool soaked in sea wind. They boarded the tram with heavy steps, boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. They nodded at Alvar, sometimes offering a brief smile, but words were rare at this hour. These men sat close to the door, arms folded across their chests, eyes closing just for a moment as the tram began its soft rumble along the rails. They smelled of the ocean before anyone else in the city had even heard it that day. Next came the baker's boy. He was young, barely 15, pale-haired and thin, always yawning, always carrying a basket covered with cloth. The basket's warmth filled the tram with the scent of fresh bread, the kind that made even the coldest morning feel a little softer. He always sat in the same place, by the second window, cradling the basket as if it might fly away with the next bump of the rails. Alvar secretly liked this routine the most. There was something about that warm smell in a cold tram that said, "The day will be a good one." Then, at the next stop, a pair of factory workers boarded. They hardly spoke to each other. Conversation would begin later, after the shift ended and fatigue loosened their voices. In the early morning, they sat with hands tucked into their coat sleeves, fingers stiff from the cold. Their gloves smelled faintly of machine oil. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though saving all their energy for the long hours ahead. Sometimes, one of them offered Alvar a nod of recognition, the subtle gesture of men who travelled the same path every day, sharing the same unspoken respect for routine. Then came the seamstress from Copley. She always boarded quietly, her footsteps light on the wooden steps. She wore a long coat buttoned tightly, a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and a hat pulled low to protect her from the wind. In her hands, she carried a small tin box of sewing needles and spools of thread. At this hour, her eyes looked both tired and peaceful, as if she had already accepted whatever the day would bring. She always chose the seat closest to the lantern, where the soft glow touched her face. Sometimes she closed her eyes for the entire ride, leaning slightly toward the warmth. Sometimes she gazed out the window, watching the sleeping city pass by in slow, blurred shapes. Alvar never spoke to her, not once. But after years of driving the same route, he felt as though he knew her rhythm, her silence, even her breath. Later came the old man with the cane. He moved slowly, with careful steps, but refused help from anyone. His coat was long, his beard white, his eyes sharp even at dawn. He had once been a teacher, or so people whispered, but no one knew for certain. Every morning he took the tram 2 stops, got off at the same place, and walked the rest of the way up a narrow hill. No one knew where he went or why. But he always thanked the tram with a small, respectful tap of his fingers on the railing before stepping off. Alvar always admired that gesture. It was old-fashioned, like thanking a horse for carrying you. And then there were the small surprises. A woman with a crying baby trying to reach the clinic before the morning crowd. A travelling violinist with his case wrapped in cloth so frost wouldn't damage the instrument. A pair of schoolchildren whispering excitedly about something they saw in a shop window. A postman rubbing his hands together, preparing for miles of walking ahead. A maid in a neat uniform carrying fresh linens in a tightly folded bundle. Each face carried a fragment of Tallinn's morning story. And Tram 12 became the fragile vessel holding them all. As the tram rolled deeper into the city, the windows began to fog from the warmth of bodies and breath. Alvar cracked the pane slightly to let out the moisture, letting in the crisp morning air. The rails clicked beneath him in a steady rhythm, a rhythm he knew by heart, a rhythm the passengers unconsciously listened to as they slowly woke inside the wooden carriage. No one spoke loudly. No one hurried. The tram moved as gently as the early light itself. At the hill near Tumpia, the tram always slowed to a thoughtful crawl. Alvar could feel the engines straining slightly, pushing against the incline. The passengers leaned subtly with the movement, like leaves drifting in a shared breeze. The lantern flickered, casting soft, wavering shadows across the benches. When the tram reached the main square, the sky finally shifted from grey to pale gold. The merchants were beginning to set up their stalls. Horses huffed white breath, and the first signs of life stretched across the waking streets. The city had opened its eyes. The seamstress tightened her scarf. The old man tapped the railing again. The baker's boy adjusted the cloth on his basket. The fisherman stepped off with heavy, steady movements. For Alvar, this was always the moment that felt like the true beginning of the day. Not the dawn, not the first cup of tea, but the first time the tram emptied and filled again, like a heart taking its first real breath after a long night. He guided tram 12 forward, hands steady on the controls. Outside, Tallinn came alive slowly, like a long-forgotten painting gaining colour, stroke by stroke. Inside, the early passengers carried the quiet warmth of their small routines, and Alvar carried them gently, one stop at a time, through a city learning how to move with wheels and rails. A tram's route is more than a line drawn across a map. It is a thread of memory, a rhythm, a quiet promise repeated day after day. For Alvar, the path of tram 12 was not simply a set of stops. It was a living corridor of Tallinn itself, stitched together with rails that shimmered under frost and summer dust alike. He knew every metre of it, not as a driver studies a route, but as a person learns the contours of a familiar dream. Tram 12 began near the harbour, where salt air clung to the wooden piers and gulls circled above like impatient spirits. The mornings were coldest here. Fog rose from the water in soft white pillars, blurring the outlines of moored ships. Nets hung from posts like tired curtains, dripping with last night's sea. Rope coils, damp barrels, the faint metallic scent of anchors, all of it shaped the first breath of the day. When Alvar eased the tram forward from the depot, the harbour was the first to greet him. Fishermen moved slowly across the pier, carrying buckets of the morning's catch or mending their nets with numb fingers. Some lifted their heads as tram 12 passed, offering a simple nod. The tram bell chimed softly, not as a warning, but as a greeting. The sound echoed strangely over water, gentler than it did over cobblestones. Leaving the harbour, the rails curved into wider streets lined with wooden houses, typical of early 20th century Tallinn. Their walls were painted in faded greens, pale blues, and yellows worn by decades of storms. Smoke drifted from chimneys in thin columns. Curtains fluttered as someone inside pulled them aside to check the weather. Cats curled on stone steps. Laundry hung stiff in the cold morning wind. These houses watched the tram pass every day, like old neighbours who never spoke but always acknowledged each other. The first stop stood near a small bakery. Even before sunrise, its ovens were already burning. The air here carried a different warmth. Rye bread, sweet pastries, a hint of burnt sugar. Passengers board and leave in a murmuring flow. Bakers carrying trays, a sleepy girl with a school satchel, a man wrapping his scarf tighter as he climbs aboard. In winter, the warm air from the bakery fogs the tram windows for a brief, gentle moment. From there, tram 12 glided toward the market square. This was one of Alvar's favourite segments. The rails here ran straight, letting the tram settle into a smooth, even hum. In summer, the square was bright with stalls. Red apples, dark bread loaves, smoked fish, woven baskets. In winter, the square seemed almost abandoned, but the life never vanished completely. Vendors stomped their boots to stay warm. A small group of horses huffed steam into the air. A child always seemed to be running between stalls, chasing something only children can see. The tram paused beside the market, letting on merchants with crates balanced on their knees, elderly women clutching coin purses, and young boys delivering rolls of newspapers tied with twine. They all carried the scent of their morning: cold leather, fresh ink, or the smoke of a small stove burning inside a stall. Then came the narrow climb toward the old town. The rails bent upward, entering streets that seemed older than memory. Medieval walls rose on either side. Their stones held centuries of wind and war. Church towers loomed ahead, dark silhouettes against the lightening sky. In this part of the route, the tram always moved more slowly. Cobblestones grew tighter and more uneven. The sound changed too. The wheels didn't hum here. They clicked and clattered, bouncing softly on the old stones. Passengers grabbed seat edges to steady themselves. Alvar adjusted the throttle with extra care, feeling the weight of every bump in his hands. At the foot of Tumpi Hill, the tram paused at one of its most meaningful stops. Here, the old man with the cane always disembarked. As he stepped off the tram, he would turn slightly and tap the railing with his fingers, a small, dignified gesture of gratitude. Alvar always watched him disappear up the cobbled path, moving slowly past the ancient walls. He never learned where the old man went, but somehow he imagined it was a place filled with books and quiet, perhaps an archive or a classroom where memory was kept alive. Beyond Tuampia, the route curved again, descending toward the busier part of the city. Shops opened their shutters. Street cleaners swept fallen leaves or snow. Children began appearing in small clusters, their boots pattering against stone as they ran ahead of their parents. The tram rang its bell more often here, not out of impatience, but as part of the daily dialogue with pedestrians and horse carts sharing the roads. Then came the industrial district, perhaps the least beautiful, but the most alive. Factories with tall chimneys shook the morning air with deep, rhythmic breaths of steam. Workers poured out in groups, their faces tired even at dawn. The rails here ran straight, but felt rough under the wheels, as if absorbing the weight of the labour around them. When the tram passed, the workers always turned their heads. Some waved, some simply stared, lost in thoughts. Some stepped aboard with soot-smudged gloves and the smell of iron in their hair. For Alvar, this section demanded the most attention. The mix of horse carts, delivery wagons, and tram lines turned the streets into a slow-moving puzzle. He guided Tram 12 with a precision honed through years. The slight tilt of the throttle, the careful timing of the bell. He always felt strangely protective here, as though the tram needed more guidance, more focus, more care not to drown in the heavy rhythm of machinery surrounding it. And then, almost suddenly, the rails turned away from the noise. Tall trees rose along the path. The air changed, as if someone opened a door into a quieter world. Leaves rustled overhead. Branches cast soft shadows over the tracks. Tram 12 glided under them like a carriage entering a forest corridor. This was the approach to Kadriorg. Kadriorg was different, softer, more measured, more patient with itself. Elegant wooden houses with decorative trims stood on either side of the tracks. Gardens slept under blankets of fallen leaves in autumn or snow in winter. The palace grounds were never far, their paths empty at this hour. Even the birds sounded different here. Fewer gulls, more sparrows and small finches hopping along rail edges. The last part of the route, leading to the final stop, always felt like an exhale. The wheels softened their sound. The lantern flickered in a slower rhythm. The passengers grew quiet in a different way. Not tired, but contemplative. Alvar often felt the tram relax beneath him in these final moments of the journey. As if Tram 12 itself was grateful for the long glide through trees after climbing stone streets and weaving through market noise. When the tram reached the end of the line, Alvar would pull the brake gently, feeling the familiar settling of the wooden frame. The passengers stepped off one by one, disappearing into narrow paths, iron gates, or quiet side streets. The tram rested for a minute or two, letting its warmth escape into the morning air. And then, when the time came, Alvar reversed the controls, rang the bell softly, and began the journey back. The same path, but never the same morning. This was his route. A loop through fishermen's piers, bakeries, markets, medieval walls, factories, and gardens. A map of Tallinn not drawn in ink, but lived in motion. Alvar knew every sound, every turn, every rise of the street. And as he guided Tram 12 through its daily cycle, he felt as though he was stitching together the pieces of a city that was still learning how to move into a new century. There were drivers who watched the city, others who counted minutes and stops. Some cared only for the rails and the technical discipline of their work. But Alvar belonged to a different group entirely, a very small one. He listened to the city. He treated its sounds the way a musician treats notes, the way a sailor treats wind. To him, Tallinn wasn't just a place of stone and people. It was an instrument, and the tram was the bow that played across its strings. The city sounded different depending on the hour. Early mornings had their own tone, thin, fragile, almost glass-like. Footsteps echoed more clearly. The clatter of a horse pulling a cart seemed amplified, as though everything was carved into the quiet. Alvar had spent so many mornings on the rails that he could distinguish the identity of streets not by sight, but by sound alone. The harbour stretch had a low, rolling murmur, the conversation between sea and stone. The gulls cried overhead, but in the early hours their calls were softer, less insistent. The wind carried a metallic ring from the buoys and chains that clinked against wooden docks. When Tram 12 rolled along the first meters of its route, the rails slipped into a rhythm that felt different from any other part of the city. A faint, distant vibration that suggested open water, even though the tram itself never touched the waves. Further inland, the tone shifted. Wooden houses absorbed sound differently than stone. Their walls softened echoes, making the tram's wheels seem almost polite as they clicked along the track. Alvar always felt that these neighbourhoods were listening back, the old houses leaning slightly toward the street, as if to catch the small bell chime or the murmur of sleepy passengers. The market square had its own chaotic melody, even at dawn. The clatter of crates being lifted, the thump of boots on wet cobblestones, the occasional shout of a vendor who was already bargaining with someone unseen. When the tram passed this part of the city, the noise formed a brief swell, like the crescendo of a song. Alvar could tell which stalls were already open simply by the cadence of the sounds drifting through the tram windows. But the old town had the most complicated music. Every stone, every archway, every narrow street produced its own resonance. The wheels of Tram 12 struck the cobblestones like fingers on uneven piano keys. Sometimes the sound was clear and sharp. Other times it was muffled, as though swallowed by centuries of footsteps. Passing under the shadow of the limestone walls of Tumpia, the sound deepened, a subtle, hollow echo that made the tram feel smaller, more fragile, like a small wooden breath in a canyon of stone. The city changed through the seasons too. In winter, the cold sharpened every sound. The wheels screeched more easily when the rails iced over. Frost made the metal ring with a brittle clarity. The wind carried sounds farther, the slam of a door, the bark of a dog, the whistle of a factory foreman. Snow muffled much of it, turning the city into a gentler, quieter place where the tram's hum seemed almost intimate. In spring, the thaw softened everything. Water dripped from rooftops, sloshed in the gutters, and raced along the edges of the tracks. Birds returned, filling the morning with small, bright whistles. The rails shimmered with moisture, and the tram's wheels glided more smoothly, producing a softer, more fluid rhythm. Summer brought its own symphony, open windows spilling laughter, children's voices chasing themselves across squares, the distant metallic clatter of workers repairing something, always something, in the warmth. In this season, the tram's bell blended with the cheerful noise of the city, becoming part of its daily music instead of cutting through it. But autumn was the season Alvar loved most. The city became more deliberate. Leaves scraped along the ground in thin, crisp threads. The wind carried the earthy smell of wet bark, mingling with chimney smoke. The rails were covered in yellow and orange leaves that the tram swept aside with each pass. And the sound, oh, the sound, turned rich, deeper. The softened surfaces made the wheels sing lower notes, almost like a cello tuned half-step down. Alvar listened to all of this instinctively. He could tell when someone walked toward the tram stop just by the cadence of their footsteps. Heavy boots meant a worker. Soft, quick steps meant the seamstress. Uneven taps meant the old man with the cane. He knew when a street was empty, when a door opened, when a horse shook its head. And he knew the voices of the passengers too, their coughing, their murmurs, their sighs as they settled onto benches. More than anything, he listened to the tram itself. Tram 12 was never silent. Its language was made of vibrations and breaths, ticks and shivers, 100 small signs that only someone who cared would interpret correctly. Alvar knew when the left axle complained or when a bolt loosened by even a fraction. He knew the difference between a harmonious hum and a troubled tremor. He knew the sound of the brakes on cold mornings versus their sound after hours of travel. He could feel, not just hear, when the alignment was slightly off on the bend near the market square. Sometimes he could predict a problem before it emerged, simply because a new tone had entered the tram's voice, a tone no one else would notice. The mechanics joked that Alvar heard with his boots because he often identified issues based on the tiny vibrations traveling up from the rails. Listening shaped more than his work. It shaped his understanding of the city. He knew where the city felt lonely, the quiet residential streets just after dawn, where only one lamp burned in a window. He knew where it felt alive, the market square in mid-morning bursting with energy. He knew where it felt tired, the industrial district at dusk, when workers with soot-stained collars boarded with weary shoulders. And he knew where it felt old, the echoing stretch under the medieval walls, where even the tram seemed to hold its breath. There were moments when Alvar felt as if he wasn't driving through the city, but through its memory, through its stories, through its heartbeat. Listening gave him something no schedule or map could, an understanding of how the city moved as a living thing. When he guided the tram, he wasn't navigating rails. He was navigating the moods of Tallinn itself. Cities speak, but only a few people ever learn to listen. Alvar was one of them. And because of that, every day on Tram 12 felt less like a job and more like participating in an ongoing, unfolding symphony, one that began long before him and would fade long after he was gone. The evenings held a different rhythm for Tram 12. a slower and more intimate pulse that belonged only to the part of the day when work began to unravel and settle into rest. For Alvar, the return to the depot was not simply the end of a shift. It was a descent into a gentler world, one that floated between noise and silence, between the living city and the machines that carried it. The final passengers always stepped off with tired movements, leaving the tram in a soft hush that deepened with each empty seat. Their footsteps faded down narrow streets, merging into the scattered echoes of the evening. The markets had quieted, their stalls dismantled, their smells of fruit and smoked fish lingering faintly in the cooling air. The workers of the industrial district moved like shadows now, their faces softened by dusk. Children had gone home, shop signs dimmed one by one. Tallinn exhaled. Alvar guided Tram 12 through these final stretches with a different kind of care. Not the alertness required in morning bustle, nor the precision demanded by midday crowds, but a calm, almost ritualistic gentleness. The tram's wheels rolled more softly on the rails, as though the wooden carriage itself sensed the approach of rest. The sky deepened into a muted blue, and street lamps flickered on across the city. These early electric bulbs gave off a thin, pale glow, their light trembling against the stone walls. They illuminated the rails like thin silver threads guiding the tram home. Alvar always thought the city looked more honest in this light, less dressed, less hurried, almost vulnerable. Leaving the last residential stop, the tram moved through the quiet lanes near Kadriorg. Gardens lay dark behind their fences. The leaves in the trees whispered with the wind, their movements casting shifting patterns on the tram windows. The palace grounds, usually bright during the day, now seemed distant and still, as though paused in deep thought. The rails curved, and the night air thickened with the faint scent of cooling metal. This smell always marked the beginning of the tram's slow unwinding, the mechanical equivalent of a deep stretch at the end of a long day. The tram hummed in low tones that Alvar recognized instantly. He had driven this route long enough to hear the difference between the tram's daytime voice and its evening one. As Tram 12 approached the industrial district, the sounds shifted again. During the day, this place roared, but now the factories released their last clouds of steam in exhausted sighs. Their chimneys exhaled faint whistles, like tired breaths escaping the bodies of giants. Workers had mostly gone home. Only a few silhouettes lingered, closing iron gates or sweeping debris from the entrance. The metallic clangs that dominated the morning now echoed in long, slow reverberations. The tram moved past these remnants with a kind of empathy. The rails here were still warm from the day's activity, radiating a fading heat that made the wheels sing a slightly higher note. Alvar watched the shadows of chimneys stretch across the ground, elongating with every passing minute until they dissolved into the darkness. Beyond the factories, the path sloped downward toward the harbour again. The sea had its own evening mood, deeper, heavier, more patient. The gulls' calls grew sharper, and the water slapped against the wooden posts with a slow, rhythmic persistence. Lanterns on anchored ships swayed gently, leaving trails of orange reflections across the surface. Rope creaked, chains groaned. The air tasted of salt and the faint bitterness of coal. In these moments, Alvar always sensed how the city returned to its oldest roots. No matter how many rails or wires Tallinn built, the sea remained the first heartbeat, and everything else merely followed its rhythm. The depot stood near the far end of the pier district, a long wooden structure with wide doors and tall beams that supported a roof stained with decades of smoke. Its windows glowed faintly with lamplight, creating the impression of a giant creature resting in its den. As Alvar guided Tram 12 closer, he could already hear the familiar chorus that marked the depot at dusk. The low groans of cooling engines, the hisses of steam leaking gently from valves, the clinking of tools as mechanics finished their final checks. Inside, the air was always thick with the mixed scent of oil, wood, and electricity. The space was vast, but the quiet hum of machines filled it in a warm, enveloping way. Tram 7 rested in one corner, its lantern still flickering weakly. Tram 4 stood beside a workbench, one of its panels removed, while a mechanic wiped his hands on a rag. Several trolleys hung overhead in the rafters, shadows shifting above like sleeping birds. Alvar slowed the tram at the entrance until he felt the rails flatten out into the depot's central path. The sound here changed once more, the hollow thud of wooden wheels rolling over planks instead of stone. He guided Tram 12 to its assigned spot, aligning the carriage in a straight line with the grid of tracks. When he applied the brake, the last vibration shimmered through the frame before fading into stillness. In that stillness, the tram breathed. No other word described it so perfectly. The metal expanded softly as it cooled, releasing tiny ticks and clicks like a settling chest. Steam made faint hisses from joints loosened by the day's movement. Wires creaked. The lantern glass trembled gently as the flame inside adjusted to the new air. The tram seemed almost alive, a wooden creature that had spent the whole day carrying people and was now relaxing, letting its internal tension dissolve. Alvar remained seated for a moment, listening to this quiet exhalation. It was a sound he had grown to love more than any other. The daytime rush, the chatter of passengers, the noise of the city, all of it faded here. Only the intimate sounds remained, the ones shared only between the driver and the machine. He extinguished the lantern with a gentle pinch of the wick, watching the smoke curl upward in a thin grey thread. The dim twilight inside the depot softened around him. He placed the day's logbook on the dashboard, noting the mileage and any small vibrations he wanted the mechanics to inspect. Then he wiped the controls with a cloth he kept in his jacket pocket, not out of duty, but out of affection. Stepping off the tram, he placed a hand on its wooden frame, feeling the residual warmth. This gesture had become a habit without him realizing it, a small, silent thank you. He closed the depot door behind him, letting the final sounds of cooling engines echo briefly before being sealed inside. Outside, the evening air was sharp and clean. The city lights shimmered across puddles left by afternoon rain, turning the ground into a mosaic of gold reflections. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, slow and solemn. The smell of the sea drifted past again, mingling with chimney smoke. As Alvar walked toward his small rented room, he glanced back at the depot. Through a gap in the wooden boards, he saw the vague, warm glow of the lamps inside. Tram 12 and the others would rest there until dawn, waiting for the next day's rhythm. The city had its nights, the trams had their breaths, and Alvar, walking home under the dim glow of early street lamps, carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had guided a small piece of the city safely through another day. The walk home after a long day on the rails was a ritual Alvar never hurried. The city moved differently at night, and he felt compelled to match its slower, deeper rhythm. When he left the depot, the noises of cooling engines faded behind him, replaced by the soft hush of Tallinn's nighttime breath. The streets seemed broader in the dark, as though shadows stretched the distance between buildings and softened the edges of the world. Tallinn at night did not sleep. It simply quieted. Lamps flickered along the narrow streets, their glass domes glowing with a pale amber that pooled gently onto cobblestones. The light was never steady. It wavered with the wind, dancing in uncertain patterns that made the stones shimmer as Alvar passed. His boots made soft, measured clicks, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the thickness of the evening air. He knew the route home as intimately as he knew the rails of Tram 12. It wound through small squares where the day's noise had dissolved into silence, past shuttered bakeries still carrying a trace of warm flower scent, and along canals where the water reflected the lamps like broken ribbons of gold. At night, even familiar streets felt older, as if the city shed its daytime veneer and revealed something ancient beneath. As he walked, Alvar carried the day with him, not as a burden, but as a kind of lingering warmth. He could still feel the vibration of the tram's wheels beneath his feet, the rhythmic sway of the carriage, the hum of the electric lines overhead. These sensations stayed with him long after he stepped away from the controls. His body seemed reluctant to let go of the motion, as though still gliding along invisible tracks. He often paused on bridges. From there, he watched the reflections of street lamps ripple across the dark canal water. The lights blurred with each small gust of wind, becoming gentle strokes of color, like smudged paint on a black canvas. Occasionally, a boat creaked in the distance, its ropes tightening and loosening with the tide. These faint, lonely sounds made the city feel alive in a different, more private way, as if it only shared this side of itself with those willing to walk home after midnight. Passing the old town walls, he always felt a quiet weight settle over the path. The stones here absorbed sound differently, holding echoes as though reluctant to release them. Even the wind seemed to move more cautiously, slipping through archways in long, soft breaths. Lantern light clung to the ancient stones, turning them into tall silhouettes carved from memory. Alvar imagined how many footsteps had passed here before him, and how many would come long after he was gone. The thought made the night feel both vast and intimate. He also thought about the tram, not with longing, but with a kind of affection that surprised even him. Tram 12 had become more than a machine. It was a small, moving world, a companion whose rhythms shaped his days. He knew its strengths, its small complaints, its tired groans at the end of each evening. And as he walked home, he often pictured it resting in the depot, warm wood cooling, metal settling, lantern dimmed. He liked to imagine the tram sleeping, ready to wake again at dawn when the city reclaimed its noise. Sometimes, fragments of passengers lingered in his mind. The seamstress adjusting her scarf, the baker's boy dozing with his basket, the old man tapping the railing with his cane, the workers smelling of smoke and iron. Their lives brushed past his every day, intersecting with his own for brief, quiet moments. He never learned their names, but he knew their silhouettes, their footsteps, the way they breathed when tired or hopeful. These details clung to him throughout the walk home, slowly dissolving into the night like steam fading into cold air. As he moved farther from the center, the city grew stiller. Windows glowed faintly behind curtains, revealing silhouettes of families finishing the day. A woman folded laundry. A man hung his coat on a peg. Someone wound a clock, its tick briefly echoing through an open window. These glimpses soothed him. Life continued in countless small rooms, unnoticed but real. The wind near the outskirts carried the smell of wet earth and sawdust from a carpenter's workshop that closed earlier in the evening. Alvar always slowed near this place, enjoying the familiar scent. It reminded him of the wooden frame of the tram, of the polished handles and benches worn smooth by years of passengers. Even here, far from the rails, his thoughts returned to the machine that shaped his days. Reaching his neighborhood, he walked along a narrow lane lined with modest wooden houses painted in muted tones, pale greens, browns, faded blues. Their roofs slanted unevenly and their fences leaned from age, but the street felt warm in its own way. The lamps here were fewer, spaced widely, leaving patches of darkness between their reaches of light. In those dark spaces, the night seemed to breathe in and out. His own building sat near the end of the lane, a small two-story structure with a steep roof and a single lamp above the door. The lamp buzzed quietly, flickering with a tired, stubborn glow. Alvar always paused before entering, not out of hesitation, but to enjoy the last moments of the walk, the cool air, the soft shadows, the quiet that wrapped itself around him like a comforting cloak. Inside, his room was simple. A narrow bed, a table, a small stove, a shelf with a few items he had collected over years. He lit a single candle, letting its flame steady before removing his coat. The room warmed slowly, shadows shifting as the candlelight touched each corner. On the table lay his small notebook, its pages filled with observations made during idle moments. Notes about the tram's sound, the city's mood, the weather, the unusual things he noticed along the route. He sometimes wrote a line or two before sleep, not to remember, but to release the day. He didn't write stories or opinions, only fragments. The song of wheels on wet rails, the warmth of a passenger's basket, the way fog rose in spirals near the harbour. These small entries made up the private map of his life. When he extinguished the candle, darkness filled the room, but it felt gentle. Through the window he could see a sliver of the night sky, dim but open. A faint hum from distant wires reached him, the city resting but never fully silent. Alvar lay down, hands folded on his chest, listening to that faint hum. It reminded him of the tram, of rails cooling, of wheels waiting for morning. And as sleep approached, he felt a small, steady comfort in knowing that he would rise tomorrow, step onto those same rails, and guide the city once more through its waking rhythms. Night softened everything, blurring the edges of his thoughts. Outside, Tallinn breathed in slow, ancient cycles. Inside, Alvar's world narrowed to quiet warmth. And in that final, gentle stillness, he drifted into rest. A man carried home by the city, he carried every day. There were evenings when Alvar lay awake longer than usual, listening to the distant hum of the city and letting his thoughts drift through the quiet. Sleep did not always come easily. His mind, shaped by years of repetition and subtle habits, tended to wander in gentle circles, never rushed, never restless, but persistent in its quiet questions. On those nights he found himself wondering what his place truly was in the larger rhythm of Tallinn. Driving a tram was not a profession that demanded praise or recognition. It was not a craft people spoke about with admiration, nor one that left monuments or stories behind. Yet Alvar never resented this anonymity. Instead, it gave him a strange sense of belonging. He did not need applause. He needed only the rails beneath him, the quiet movement through familiar streets, and the feeling that he was carrying the city, one small piece at a time. He often asked himself why he felt such devotion to his work, why guiding a wooden carriage along cold metal lines brought him a peace he could not find elsewhere, why the city's sounds, its breaths, its shifts in temperature and light mattered to him more than any achievement he might have chased in a different life. The answer, he realized, was woven into the rhythm itself. Each day he spent on the rails felt like participating in something larger and older than himself. The tram was not merely a machine. It was a thread that connected the lives of hundreds of people. The passengers who stepped aboard were not strangers, but fragments of the city's living story. They carried their mornings, their worries, their hopes, their fatigue, and through the simple act of transporting them, Alvar became part of their silent journeys. He had never kept a record of their names or faces, but he remembered the gestures, a fisherman rubbing his palms together to warm them, a child clutching a bag of schoolbooks, a seamstress smoothing the hem of her coat, a factory worker closing his eyes for a few precious minutes of rest. These were moments too small to be noticed by most people, yet they became the quiet architecture of Alvar's days. His job offered no grand purpose, yet it gave him something steadier, the feeling of being necessary in a gentle, unobtrusive way. If the tram did not move, if the route stopped, if he failed to guide the rails with care, the city's early hours would feel incomplete. The tram was part of the city's breath, and he was part of the tram's. He often compared his work to a heartbeat, regular, consistent, dependable, not glorious, but essential. A city needed its transportation the way a body needed rhythm. It wasn't thought about unless it faltered, and because of this, Alvar never sought attention. He simply wanted the rails to run smoothly, the wheels to hum without complaint, the passengers to arrive safely at their destinations. Sometimes, during long pauses at the final stop, he looked at the city stretching ahead and wondered how many lives he had carried without ever knowing their stories. People stepped onto the tram in one state and stepped off in another. They walked toward futures he would never see. He played a role in moments of their days, brief, quiet intervals that often passed without gratitude or even acknowledgement. But he never needed more. He found comfort in being the unnoticed bridge between their starting points and destinations. His reflections were not all solemn. There were moments of warmth too. He remembered mornings when frost painted delicate patterns across the tram's windows, and passengers leaned in to admire the fragile lines. He remembered summer days when children giggled every time the bell rang. He remembered how the scent of bread from the baker's boy always lifted the mood of everyone on board. These small scenes stitched themselves into the deeper meaning of his work, creating a sense of beauty in the mundane. There were, however, evenings when he wondered whether he had chosen too small a life, whether he had allowed routine to define him, whether the city would notice if he disappeared. But even in these moments, he found himself returning to the same conclusion. It was not the size of a life that mattered, but whether it harmonized with the world around it. Alvar's life fit Tallinn, quietly, steadily, like a note in a long, unbroken melody. He thought about the trams themselves, how new they had once seemed, how strange the wires had looked stretching across the sky, how foreign the soft electric buzz that followed their movement. Now they were part of the city's identity, as natural as chimneys or rooftops. And he was one of the men who had carried them through their early years, learning to interpret their quirks and moods before anyone else fully understood them. He sometimes imagined the future, streets filled with faster vehicles, wires replaced by unseen currents, trams becoming larger or quieter or altogether different. But he never felt threatened by these thoughts. The world would change, rails would multiply, drivers would come and go. But the early years, the formative years, the fragile decades when the tram was still a novelty, that period would always belong to men like him. To those who loved the machine, not only for its function, but for its voice. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his work was a kind of caretaking. Not of the passengers individually, but of their passage through time and space. He ensured their journeys unfolded with as little friction as possible. He guided their mornings into days, their evenings into nights. He protected the quiet flow of the city's pulse, and he did it without being seen. Sometimes, standing alone on a bridge at night, he watched the faint glow of a distant tram moving across another line. Its light glimmered like a lantern carried through the veins of the city. He felt a connection to that distant driver, another figure guiding another group of silent passengers. Two lives running parallel, never touching, yet sharing the same responsibility. He found meaning in that parallelism, in the shared anonymity, in the quiet work that supported louder lives. More than anything, Alvar believed that purpose did not always announce itself with clarity. It could exist in the shadows of daily tasks, in the softness of small habits, in the unnoticed consistency of showing up. And perhaps that was enough. Tallinn did not celebrate him. No record of his name would appear in newspapers or history books. But he guided the city faithfully through its early years of electricity and rails, through its cold mornings and humid summers. He kept the rhythm of a tram alive, long enough for it to become part of something bigger than himself. And when he lay awake at night, listening to the distant hum of machinery or the whisper of wind against the window pane, he felt an unspoken truth settle quietly inside him. A small life is not an empty one. A quiet purpose is still a purpose. And a man who carries others, even for a short while each day, leaves a trace more lasting than he ever realizes. Tallinn had been a city of slow footsteps long before the first tram bell rang across its streets. People were accustomed to moving at the pace of horses, at the rhythm of carts rolling unevenly over cobblestones, at the patient tempo set by their own legs. When the tram arrived, the city did not change all at once. It shifted gradually, like a tide creeping across familiar shores. And Alvar, who had been among the first to guide these electric carriages through the old narrow lanes, witnessed this transformation with the quiet awareness of someone positioned at the hinge between two eras. In the early years, the tram felt like an intruder, thin, delicate wires threading above the streets, metal rails slicing into ancient stone, sparks whispering along the overhead lines. Many citizens approached it with caution. Some stepped back whenever it passed, uncertain if the machine's hum carried danger. Others watched from doorways, arms folded, as though judging whether this new arrival deserved a place in their city at all. But slowly, the tram began to weave itself into the fabric of Tallinn's days. Children were always the first to grow accustomed to it. They chased after it like a moving curiosity, laughing when the bell chimed or when sparks flickered blue in the morning gloom. Their acceptance softened the adults. The tram became less of a novelty and more of a convenience. Workers discovered they could reach the factories faster. Market sellers realized they could arrive before dawn without walking long distances in the cold. Families found it easier to travel across districts that once felt too distant to reach regularly. Alvar watched this shift from the inside, from the driver's seat, where every reaction, every hesitation, every triumph unfolded as small details on the faces passing before him. He saw the first time a grandmother dared to board alone, gripping the rail with a mixture of fear and determination. He saw how, weeks later, she stepped on with confidence, choosing a seat near the window with the calm of someone who had claimed a small victory over time. He saw the group of older men who once mocked the tram as unnecessary, men who eventually began riding it on cold mornings, shaking their heads, but sitting with relief as the carriage carried them gently uphill. The tram's presence changed the sound of the city. It added a new pulse, the soft clatter of wheels on rails, the faint electrical hum, the bell's clear, almost musical tone. These sounds layered themselves onto Tallinn's existing melodies: church bells, market chatter, the creak of harbour ropes, without overwhelming them. Instead, they blended into something new, something distinctly modern, yet surprisingly gentle. The tram brought movement that felt steady rather than rushed, purposeful rather than chaotic. Before long, the timetable itself became part of daily life. People began structuring their mornings and evenings around the predictable appearance of the tram at specific corners. At first, this rhythm felt strange to those who had always lived according to the sun or the church bells. But soon, it became a comfort. Alvar could see the change in the way people gathered at stops, how they began arriving a few minutes early, how they glanced down the tracks with quiet expectation. The tram gave the city a sense of connection it had never fully possessed. It bridged the harbour with the market square, the old town with the factories, the residential lanes with the palace gardens. These places had always existed beside one another, but now they were tied with a thin metal thread that made distances feel smaller, more intimate. As the years passed, new buildings appeared along the tram routes: shops, workshops, small cafes, whose doors opened toward the street as if anticipating the flow of passengers. Wooden houses were repaired, repainted, strengthened to face the increasing foot traffic that the tram brought. Stone structures were polished, their owners proud to stand along the path of modernity. Even the old lampposts seemed to burn brighter in the tram's presence, as if their purpose too had been renewed. Alvar witnessed how the city's mood evolved, how uncertainty mellowed into familiarity, how suspicion dissolved into reliance. He noticed that people began to walk with more confidence, even with a bit more haste, knowing they had a dependable way to reach their destinations. He observed how the pace of commerce shifted. Deliveries arrived faster, customers travelled farther, tradesmen expanded their services. The tram transformed Tallinn into a more cohesive organism, each part feeding into another with smoother rhythm. But the change was not only external. It reached into people's habits, their thoughts, their sense of distance. For the first time, a worker living near Kadriorg could accept a job in the industrial district without calculating the exhausting morning walk. A young woman could visit relatives across town without spending half the day on foot. Students could travel to schools previously too far to be practical. Even the elderly found themselves venturing outside more frequently, confident that the tram would carry them gently through the city. These were the transformations Alvar found most meaningful. Not the visible ones, new rails, new posts, new wires, but the subtle shifts in the lives of ordinary people. He felt he was witnessing a quiet revolution, one that unfolded not through declarations or grand inventions, but through the silent easing of daily burdens. He sometimes imagined what the city had looked like before the tram, before electric lines had stitched the sky, before streets knew the taste of metal rails. He thought of people walking long distances in snow, of goods transported at the mercy of tired horses, of neighborhoods that felt like small worlds unto themselves. And then he looked out from the driver's window at the passengers seated behind him and felt the undeniable truth that the tram had brought the city closer, physically, emotionally, rhythmically. It was strange to think that in his own quiet way he was part of that shift. He did not build the tram. He did not design the network. He did not invent the technology. Yet he carried the movement forward, one gentle, attentive journey at a time. Tallinn was changing, and Alvar stood at the center of its transformation, guiding its earliest threads of modern life through narrow medieval streets. He often wondered what the city would look like in decades to come, whether trams would grow faster or quieter, whether the rails would expand into new districts, whether children yet unborn would someday look at pictures of these early electric carriages with curiosity, unable to imagine a time when they were considered new. But such thoughts always drifted away because Alvar believed in the present more than the future. He believed in the slow unfolding of now, the rhythmic clatter of wheels, the hum of electric lines, the patient movement through streets that had existed long before he was born. He understood that progress did not erase the past. It simply layered itself upon it, like ink on parchment. And the tram, in its own steady way, had become part of Tallinn's evolving story. A story written not in bold strokes, but in quiet lines traced across early morning fog and evening lamplight. Alvar had spent years guiding those lines. And though few would remember his name, the city itself remembered the paths he kept alive. His work was not about engines or wheels. It was about connection, about motion, about carrying a city into its next chapter without letting it lose the gentle rhythm that made it home. Long before Alvar became part of the city's morning rhythm, before passengers associated the soft chime of Tram 12 with his steady hands, there had been a period of uncertainty, a time when nothing felt familiar, when the tram itself seemed like a creature he did not yet understand. Those early days were filled with small anxieties, clumsy movements, and the fragile hope that someday the rails would make sense to him. He often remembered his first morning in the depot. It was a chilly spring day, the kind where snowmelt still clung to the edges of gutters, leaving thin silver trails that trickled into puddles. The air inside the depot carried a scent he would later come to love: warm oil, varnished wood, and the faint metallic note of overhead wires waking from the night. But on that first day, the smell overwhelmed him. Everything felt too sharp, too new. The trams stood in quiet rows, their lamps flickering faintly as mechanics finished their morning inspections. They seemed taller then, almost imposing, wooden giants with glass eyes and iron bones. Alvar walked between them with careful steps, uncertain if he was intruding. He remembered running his fingers lightly along the frame of one carriage, feeling the smoothness of polished oak and the cold bite of metal hinges. It was the first moment he sensed what these machines might become to him, though he didn't yet recognize the feeling. His training began before sunrise. The senior drivers gathered in a small corner of the depot, sipping steaming cups of coffee from metal mugs, speaking in low voices. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who knew the city's streets better than they knew their own homes. Alvar, sitting slightly apart from them, felt like an outsider. His hands were restless. His thoughts kept circling the same worry, that he would not learn fast enough, that the tram would reject him, that the rails would reveal every hesitation in his movements. The first time he stepped onto the platform of the training carriage, the floorboards creaked under his weight. The instructor explained the controls. This lever for speed, this handle for brakes, this switch for reversing direction, this cord for the bell. The instructions felt alien, as though he were being taught the vocabulary of a language he had never heard before. His fingers trembled slightly when he touched the controls for the first time, tracing the smooth metal surfaces that would one day become so familiar. The initial practice runs were slow and quiet. The tram rolled along an isolated track behind the depot, passing between stacks of wooden crates and rows of spare wheels. Alvar kept his movements small, almost timid. Each adjustment of the throttles seemed too sharp, each attempt at braking too sudden. The tram responded with small jolts and shivers. Nothing dangerous, but enough to remind him that this machine demanded patience, attention, and respect. He remembered the embarrassment of misjudging his first turn. The tram lurched slightly, its wheels protesting with a sharp scrape against the rail. It was not a serious mistake, but the sound lodged itself in his mind. For hours afterward, he replayed it in his thoughts, wincing at the memory. Later, when he watched experienced drivers guide their trams with effortless grace, he wondered if he would ever reach that level of calm precision. But slowly, something shifted. He began to observe the subtleties, the way the tram's weight influenced its momentum, the slight delay between movement of the lever and response of the wheels, the faint hum of the electric lines overhead. He noticed that the machine had a rhythm, almost like breathing, an ebb and flow of energy that revealed itself only to those willing to listen. Once he began to sense that rhythm, the controls made more sense. The rails felt less intimidating. The movements of the tram became less mechanical, more organic. His first day carrying passengers was a turning point he often revisited in memory. He had woken before dawn, nerves knotting in his stomach. The city outside was washed in pale blue, still half asleep. He walked to the depot with the hesitant step of someone approaching a threshold he wasn't certain he deserved to cross. When the tram was assigned to him, lightweight, newly polished, lanterns burning steadily, he felt a mixture of pride and dread. The first passengers climbed aboard near the harbour. Their quiet footsteps, the wet scent of sea-soaked boots, the faint murmur of tired voices, all of it filled the carriage with a fragile life. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him as he gripped the controls. For the first few meters, his movements were stiff, overly careful. But the tram responded faithfully, gliding forward with the grace of a creature finally recognizing its handler. As he rolled deeper into the city, something remarkable happened. The passengers trusted him. They did not question his abilities or sense his inexperience. They surrendered to the journey, allowing themselves to be carried. This silent act of faith steadied him more than any instruction manual or practice run ever had. There were still small mistakes in those early weeks. A brake applied a second too late, a turn taken too cautiously, a bell rung twice when once would have sufficed. But each error taught him something new, and slowly the tram began to feel like an extension of himself. He could sense its mood through the vibrations in the floorboards. He could predict the wheel's reaction to weather, how rain slicked the rails, how frost made them brittle, how heat softened the wooden frame. He also learned to read the passengers, not their stories, but their states of mind. The way someone tired leaned against the window, the way someone anxious tapped their fingers on their bag, the way someone hopeful sat upright, watching the city blur by with bright eyes. He found comfort in these small human details, even though he would never know the deeper truths behind them. As months passed, he discovered his own rhythm. The mornings became familiar rituals. The evenings softened into gentle closure. The rails no longer felt narrow or confining. They felt like pathways through the living heart of the city. What surprised Alvar most about those early days was how quickly they faded once he found his balance. Not because they lacked significance, but because they had become absorbed into the larger story of his work. The uncertainties, the tremors, the quiet fears, they lingered only as whispers, reminders of how far he had come. Yet whenever he passed the old training track behind the depot, he always slowed slightly. The crates were still there. The spare wheels still rested in their rows. The narrow stretch of rails still curved into the shadows like a forgotten sentence. Seeing it brought an unexpected gentleness to his chest, a memory of the man he had once been, unsure and hesitant, learning to listen to a machine that would shape the rest of his life. Those first days were not glamorous. They held no applause, no recognition. But they formed the foundation of everything that followed. The trust between driver and tram, the ease with which he guided the rails, the quiet devotion he carried into every journey. In the end, those early moments mattered precisely because they were so fragile. From them grew a life of steady purpose. From them emerged a man who came to understand the city not through books or speeches, but through motion, sound, and patience. And whenever he thought back to that trembling first morning, he felt a quiet gratitude for the uncertainty. Without it, he would have never learned to listen. And listening was what made every day on the rails feel like home. The rhythm of the rails changed with every season, and Alvar learned to read the year not by dates on calendars, but by the way Tram 12 moved through Tallinn. The city breathed differently in winter than in spring, and the tram answered to these shifts with its own subtle reactions, as though the machine were another inhabitant of the city, one with moods shaped by weather and light. Winter was the most demanding season, and it arrived quietly at first. Frost began to form along the rails like delicate silver veins, shining faintly in the pale light of early mornings. Alvar always felt winter before he saw it. The cold crept into the tram's wooden frame, making the wheels emit a sharper, tighter hum. The overhead wires crackled softly, touched by icy air. His gloves stiffened as he positioned his hands on the controls, and the first press of the brake during winter always held a tension that reminded him how differently the tram behaved in freezing temperatures. Tallinn itself shrank in winter. Streets emptied earlier, and the lamps cast smaller circles of light, their glow swallowed by the cold. Passengers stepped aboard bundled in heavy coats, cheeks flushed, breaths forming white clouds that faded slowly inside the carriage. Snow muted everything. Footsteps, voices, the distant sounds of horses in the squares. The tram bell felt louder than usual, its clear chime cutting through the hush. Snow piled along rooftops and fences, softening the city's edges. The tram's wheels carved thin, dark lines through the whiteness, marking a steady path through a world temporarily remade. Inside, the windows fogged with warm breath. Sometimes passengers traced shapes in the moisture with gloved fingers before settling into silence. Winter brought people closer together, physically and emotionally. Alvar often felt the quiet gratitude of passengers warming themselves against the wooden benches. Even their silences seemed softer, as though the cold outside made every shared space more precious. Spring announced itself differently. It crept into the air with dampness, loosening winter's grip. The rails glistened from melting snow, and the tram's wheels found a smoother glide, producing a gentler, almost fluid rhythm. Water dripped from the eaves of buildings, and puddles widened along the streets, reflecting lantern posts in shimmering fragments. Alvar always knew spring had returned when he heard the first birds call from the branches near Kadriorg. The sound thin but determined, a signal that warmth would soon follow. Passengers shed their heavy coats, carrying baskets or packages that smelled faintly of fresh earth, early flowers, or produce newly arrived at the market. The city's colours brightened as shutters opened again, and children ran more freely through the squares. The tram's windows remained clear now, no longer fogged by winter breath, and sunlight cast shifting patterns across the passengers' laps. The rails also changed. They began to sing again, soft, rhythmic notes as Tram 12 glided along smoother surfaces. Spring storms did occasionally make the overhead wires hum with nervous tension, but even the rain felt cleansing. Drops streaked the windows in long, trembling lines. The tram's movement through a spring downpour created a sound Alvar cherished, a low, continuous tremble, like a drum softened by layers of cloth. By summer, the city unfolded with full confidence. Light stretched far into the evening, and Alvar found himself driving through a Tallinn that seemed almost expansive. Tram 12 rolled past open windows, spilling laughter onto the streets. Market stalls overflowed with fruit and bread, and the air carried scents of smoke from small outdoor fires, warming spices, and flowers from gardens stirred by warm breezes. Summer brought the liveliest passengers. Children pressed their faces to the windows, delighted by the speed and sound of the tram. Workers returned home later, shoulders relaxed, boots dusty. The fishermen slept on their rides back from the harbour, hands still smelling faintly of salt and rope. Street musicians played in quiet corners. Sometimes faint melodies drifted into the tram as the doors opened, disappearing again once they closed. But summer was also hard on the tram itself. Heat softened the wooden frame, making certain spots creak more than usual. Rails expanded slightly under the sun, producing unexpected notes of metal tension. Alvar recognized these signs and adjusted his driving accordingly. He loosened his grip, slowed slightly on certain sections, and guided the tram with a tenderness reserved for living things bearing the strain of heat. Autumn arrived with no hesitation. It coated the city in layers of rust and gold. Leaves fell in soft cascades, swirling over the rails until the tram pushed through them with a gentle rustle. The sound of wheels turning through dry leaves created a warm, crackling music that made even the coldest mornings feel nostalgic. People wrapped scarves around their necks again, and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the streets as fireplaces were lit for the first time in months. The city grew contemplative in autumn. Passengers gazed out the windows longer, watching the trees shed their brightness. Morning fog thickened along the harbour, swallowing the outlines of ships and leaving behind only silhouettes. The tram's movement through fog felt like travelling through a half-formed memory. The bells sounded distant, its echo swallowed quickly. Even the hum of electricity in the overhead wires changed, muffled, wrapped in mist. Alvar found himself most attuned to the rails during this season. Fallen leaves often made the track slippery, requiring measured braking and careful control. He learned to read the fog's density by how far into the distance he could see the glimmer of lanterns on posts. The tram felt more vulnerable in autumn, and he responded with slower, more meditative movements that matched the city's own quiet descent into winter. Across all these seasons, Tram 12 remained constant, a thread running through changing days. The passengers changed their clothes, their moods, their cargo, but the tram welcomed them with the same steady rhythm. It adapted without complaint. It carried fishermen in the snow, seamstresses in the rain, workers in the heat, children in the early golden fog. And Alvar learned that the seasons were less about weather and more about texture. The way sounds deepened in winter, the way light softened in spring, the way colours sharpened in summer, the way shadows lengthened in autumn. He absorbed these textures until they became part of his craft. The city transformed again and again, and each transformation required its own understanding, its own gestures, its own patience. And the tram, always steady, always listening, moved through these changes like a quiet witness to time. For Alvar, guiding the tram through the seasons was not merely work. It was a slow, ongoing dialogue with Tallinn, one that unfolded across frost and thaw, bloom and leaf-fall. A conversation spoken in hums, rails and rhythms. And as he drove through each season year after year, he felt himself becoming part of the city's breath, not through grand actions, but through the steady, faithful movement across its evolving streets. On the rare days when Alvar did not drive Tram 12, the city felt strangely unfamiliar to him. It was as though Tallinn shifted into a different shape when he was no longer guiding its rails. The streets, which normally opened themselves to him through the tram's wide windows, seemed narrower from the ground. The routes he knew intimately from the driver's seat appeared changed, altered subtly by the difference in height, speed, and perspective. He always sensed these shifts, delicate, quiet, and a little unsettling. His weekends were not filled with obligations or social visits. They unfolded with the same quiet pace that defined his daily life, yet without the framework of scheduled stops and rail lines. On these days, he woke later than usual, though never by much. Habit guided him even in rest. Morning light filtered into his small room above the bakery, casting pale beams across the wooden floor. He lay still for a few minutes, listening to the muted hum of distant movement, the slow drip of canal water, the faint clatter of carts beginning their routes, the occasional bell from a church tower easing into the morning. Without the tram's vibration beneath his feet, he felt strangely weightless. The absence of mechanical rhythm made the silence in his room feel wider. He dressed slowly, enjoying the unhurriedness of each motion. There was no rush to reach the depot, no expectation waiting at the end of the lane. The morning belonged entirely to him. He often began his weekends with a walk through the city. These walks were never planned. He simply stepped outside and let his feet choose the direction. The city revealed its details differently when he wasn't driving. He noticed things he had never seen from behind the tram window. The worn carvings on a door frame, the way ivy curled around an iron railing, the tiny scratches on a street lamp from decades of weather. He observed how the cobblestones dipped slightly in places where carts had passed for generations, creating shallow grooves that held small pools of water after rain. As he wandered through the quieter streets, he encountered familiar faces, passengers he recognized from countless morning rides. They did not always notice him. People rarely looked at tram drivers when they were not in uniform or seated at the controls. Alvar did not mind. He preferred this kind of anonymity. It allowed him to observe the city without being observed in return. Sometimes he paused near the harbour, drawn by the same pull that guided him there every morning on the rails. Without the tram, the harbour felt larger. The smell of salt water, damp rope, and tarred wood seemed sharper. Seagulls swooped low, their wings cutting through the air with effortless determination. The water reflected the grey sky in soft waves, and boats rocked gently against the pier, their hulls creaking with the rhythm of the tides. He stood there for long moments, breathing in the air, feeling the raw life of the sea, a life he had always respected but never wished to join. On other weekends, he wandered toward the market. The square was livelier than during the early hours when he drove through it. Vendors arranged fruits, fish, bread, and cloth with energetic gestures. Children tugged at their parents' hands. Dogs paced around stalls in hopeful circles. The colours and sounds formed a mosaic of movement. Alvar rarely bought anything. He simply watched, appreciating the vibrancy of the scene in a way he never could from the tram's slow glide. The market's noise washed over him, not overwhelming, but expansive, reminding him how full the city could be when he wasn't confined to the rails. There were also moments when he left the busy areas entirely, choosing quieter paths through residential districts. These streets held a different charm, a domestic warmth. Curtains swayed gently behind windows. Laundry lines bridged small courtyards. A lone cat perched on a fence, tail flicking. Smoke curled from chimneys where families prepared meals. Alvar found comfort in these simple scenes. They reminded him that while his work connected the city, life unfolded quietly in these modest corners. But no matter where he walked, there was always an underlying strangeness, the absence of the tram's constant rhythm. He felt the void of it like a missing heartbeat. After years of driving, the city's silence on weekends rang differently in his ears. He tried sometimes to imagine what his life would be without the tram, what shape his days would take, what meaning he might carve for himself. Yet the thought always dissolved into uncertainty. The tram had become too much a part of him. In the afternoons, he often returned to his room to rest. He would sit by the small window overlooking the canal, watching the ripples move slowly across the water. Boats passed occasionally, their reflections bending with the currents. The world outside his window continued its rhythm, and he felt himself drifting with it, not as a driver, but as an observer. He would sometimes read old newspapers or leaf through small notebooks filled with his observations. These notes were scattered with descriptions of sounds, weather, and fleeting impressions, tiny fragments of his daily life that he felt compelled to capture. His weekends were also the only time he allowed himself to feel the weight of solitude. During the work week, the tram offered a kind of companionship. It occupied his hands, his thoughts, his senses. The passengers, though mostly silent, filled the space with a human presence. But on his days off, the silence became wider, more reflective. He found himself thinking about the people he carried, what they did when they left the tram, what their days looked like beyond the small window of time he shared with them. He wondered if anyone ever thought of him once they stepped off, or if he lived entirely in the background of their days. Despite these contemplations, the solitude did not trouble him. It was a quiet companion. It allowed him to reflect, to breathe, to find small anchor points in the slow unraveling of time. He appreciated the stillness, even if it felt slightly untethered. Evenings on his weekends carried their own softness. He sometimes walked to a small hill overlooking the city. From there, he watched the sun settle behind the rooftops, casting long golden lines across the chimneys and towers. The tram wires stretched overhead, catching the last light in thin silver arcs. He found comfort in knowing that, even on his days off, the trams continued their routes without him. The city moved not because of him, but because of its own enduring rhythm. Night arrived gently. Lamps glowed in windows. Footsteps grew softer. Voices drifted through narrow alleys. And Alvar returned to his room with the quiet sense of a day spent in harmony with the city. His weekends were small, unremarkable, easily forgotten by anyone watching from the outside. But for him, they were necessary pauses, moments when he could step back from the rails and remember the world as a pedestrian. Before sleep, he often thought about the tram resting in the depot. He pictured it cooling in the dim light, its wooden frame releasing the last warmth of the day. He imagined the mechanics tidying their tools, the faint ticking of metal settling into stillness. These thoughts grounded him, reminding him that tomorrow would bring movement again. And when he finally closed his eyes, he drifted into a quiet place between rest and anticipation, a place shaped by the knowledge that the rails would soon call to him once more, carrying him back into the gentle, timeless rhythm of Tram 12. Over the years, Alvar drove many different trams. Some were older and creaked with every shift of weight. Some were newer, with tighter mechanisms and smoother movements. Yet none of them stayed with him the way Tram 12 did. It was the carriage he had guided through foggy mornings, icy rails, heavy rains, and long summer evenings. It was the machine that had listened to his hands for so long that their motions had become inseparable from its rhythm. Tram 12 was not simply assigned to him. In time, it began to feel like a companion. At first, he hadn't noticed the attachment forming. The tram was just a machine, and he was simply its driver. But machines, like people, reveal themselves slowly. Tram 12 had quirks that set it apart from the others, and Alvar learned them instinctively. Its wheels, for example, produced a slightly deeper tone on cold mornings than other carriages did, a low, resonant hum that settled into the rails like a warm breath. He grew to recognize the sound within seconds. Even with his eyes closed, he could identify the tram by the way it greeted the track. The wooden frame also carried a distinct personality. Unlike the newer trams whose panels were perfectly aligned, Tram 12 had one stubborn plank on its left side that creaked only when the carriage turned sharply near the industrial district. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a small protest like an old joint reminding the world of its age. Alvar came to expect it. Whenever the tram rounded that corner, he anticipated the soft groan, and when it arrived right on cue, he felt an odd comfort. It was the sound of something familiar holding steady. Inside the cabin, the controls bore the imprint of his hands. The metal lever that adjusted the speed had developed a slight shine from years of contact with his glove. The wooden handle of the brake felt warmer to him than any other, as though it retained the memory of every careful pull. The small brass bell cord above him frayed gradually where his fingers had brushed it countless times, forming a roughened patch that seemed to shape itself precisely to his touch. Mechanics sometimes joked about Tram 12's temperament. They said it complained more than the others. They spoke of tiny rattles, loose bolts, odd vibrations near the lantern bracket. But Alvar knew these weren't flaws. They were details, subtle, intricate signals that revealed how the machine felt on any given day. When the tram was tired after a long shift, its wheels whispered more softly. When the rails were slick with rain, its movement grew cautious, almost tentative. When the weather was clear and dry, it glided with confidence, humming at a higher pitch as if enjoying the smoothness of the track. Alvar felt responsible for these moods. He adjusted his driving to match them. On days when the tram trembled from the cold, he kept his turns slow and gentle. When the overhead wires buzzed with static from passing storms, he moderated speed to protect the machinery. He listened for every shift in tone, every sigh of metal, every subtle click beneath the boards. Over time, the tram responded, not consciously, but through the quiet harmony that develops when a machine and its operator learn to trust one another. Passengers sensed this connection without understanding it. They often commented on the smoothness of Tram 12, on how quietly it moved compared to others. Some preferred its benches, saying the wood felt warmer. Others claimed the lantern inside cast a softer glow. These impressions were not illusions. They were the reflections of a machine kept in balance by a driver who treated it with the same consideration one might give to a living creature. Alvar sometimes wondered if the tram recognized him. Not in the literal sense. He knew machines had no thoughts, no consciousness. But there were moments, especially in the early mornings when the depot was still, when he approached Tram 12 in the dim light and felt a sense of being welcomed. Perhaps it was the way the lantern flickered when he opened the door, or the faint scent of warm oil that drifted from the cabin, or the steady, familiar weight of the control handle resting exactly where he had left it the night before. These small details created an illusion, a gentle, comforting one, that the tram anticipated his return. When mechanics needed to take Tram 12 out of service for maintenance, Alvar felt its absence as though he had misplaced something important. Driving another tram on those days felt wrong. The controls were unfamiliar. The hum of the wheels lacked the familiar tone he listened for. The movements were either too sharp or too sluggish. He finished such shifts feeling like a guest inside someone else's home. Everything worked, but nothing resonated with him. When Tram 12 returned from repairs, its first journey felt like reopening an old book whose pages carried the memory of his hands. The machine might have been oiled, tightened, or adjusted, But beneath these changes, its core remained the same. The rails recognized it. The overhead wires hissed in a familiar pitch. The wheels rolled in their old cadence, and Alvar, easing into the driver's seat, felt the day return to its rightful shape. Sometimes, during long stretches with no passengers, he paid closer attention to the subtle dialogue between tram and track. The wheels clicked over small imperfections in the rails, tiny irregularities that only someone deeply attuned could interpret. He learned to sense when a bolt was loosening, when the alignment shifted slightly, when the brakes needed cleaning. The mechanics appreciated his reports. They said he could detect issues days before they became noticeable. To Alvar, this ability was not a skill. It was simply listening. Even the interior became part of his understanding. The wooden benches softened over time under the weight of countless passengers. The brass handles grew warm from hundreds of hands. Dust collected in corners where a cloth could never quite reach. Lamplight cast circular glows on the varnished walls, deepening the wood's amber tone. These details accumulated into a sense of presence, a reminder that Tram 12 was a vessel for countless anonymous stories. When he drove the tram at night, after the final passengers departed, the interior grew still. The lantern's flame flickered with the draft from the windows. The boards creaked as the machine shifted into rest. Alvar found these moments deeply comforting. He felt as though he were sharing the last breath of the day with an old friend. He knew that someday the tram would age beyond repair. Newer, faster carriages would replace it. The rails would evolve. The city would demand more from its machines. But Alvar felt no sadness when thinking of this inevitable future. The tram had already lived richly. It had carried thousands through their mornings and evenings. It had weathered storms, listened to laughter, absorbed silence. It had been part of a world that changed slowly, tenderly. More importantly, it had given Alvar a life of quiet purpose. He understood that his attachment to Tram 12 was not to the wood or metal alone. It was to the years shared, the memories etched into its frame, the way it allowed him to feel connected to the city's pulse. Through this machine, he found rhythm. Through this rhythm, he found meaning. And as long as Tram 12 continued to move along the rails, humming in its familiar tone, Alvar knew he would carry it with the same tenderness he carried the early mornings, the fog over the harbour, and the faint warmth of passengers waking to their own days. Among the many details that shaped Alvar's silent life on the rails, nothing was as steady and familiar as the regular passengers. They were the quiet anchors of his days, each with a rhythm so consistent that he could sense their presence before they even boarded. They were nameless to him, and he was nameless to them, yet their lives ran alongside his with such gentle regularity that he came to think of them as part of the tram's soul. Every morning began with the fisherman. Not always the same one, but always a man shaped by the sea. They walked with a particular heaviness, shoulders forward, boots damp, fingers stiff from cold wind before sunrise. Alvar recognized them by the sound of their steps, slow, deliberate, marked with the faint squish of water-soaked soles. The smell of salt always drifted in with them, mingling with the warmth of the tram. They sat near the door, letting their bodies rest in brief moments of stillness before the work ahead. Their presence became such a natural part of the morning that when a fisherman was absent, it left a small emptiness, like a missing note in a familiar melody. Then came the seamstress. She was not young, but not old either, somewhere in the age where hands begin to stiffen but still hold grace. She boarded every morning at the same stop, her scarf tied neatly, her coat buttoned with care. She carried a box of needles and threads, the faint metallic scent of them reaching Alva whenever she passed near the front. She always sat by the lantern, the one fixture inside the tram that cast the warmest glow. Her eyes softened in that light, and Alva often noticed how she closed them for a few breaths, letting the early warmth sink into her face before beginning her day. There was also a pair of factory workers who boarded together, though they rarely spoke. They walked in sync, their boots hitting the wooden steps with identical rhythmic thuds. Their hands were always shoved deep into their coat pockets, shoulders hunched as though bracing for the long hours ahead. In winter, their coats carried the scent of smoke from the furnaces. In summer, it was the smell of warm metal and dust. They always chose the same bench, sitting side by side in silence that seemed less like distance and more like a shared endurance. When one of them was absent, the other sat more stiffly, as though leaning against a space that was supposed to hold weight. Of all the regular passengers, the baker's boy brought the brightest presence. Thin, pale-haired and perpetually sleepy, he boarded with a basket of bread, so warm that steam curled faintly from beneath the cloth covering it. The smell filled the tram instantly, softening even the coldest mornings. He always sat by the same window, resting the basket on his knees, occasionally shifting to cradle it as though protecting something fragile. Sometimes he nodded off, the movement of the tram swaying him gently. When he disembarked, the warmth of the bread lingered on the wooden bench long after he disappeared into the street. The old man with the cane was the most dependable of them all. His appearance was as predictable as the first chime of the morning bell. He moved slowly but deliberately, every step measured. His coat was long and worn, brushing against the floorboards as he climbed aboard. He always chose the same spot, 2 benches from the front on the right side near the window. He held the railing for balance as the tram began to move, his fingers tapping lightly against the metal in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. He rode only 2 stops. When he stepped off, he placed his hand on the railing with a small, dignified pressure, as though acknowledging the tram's service before making his way toward the quiet street that led uphill. The gesture repeated day after day, year after year, imprinting itself into Alva's memory with the weight of ritual. There were others whose presence shaped the route. The postman with his leather satchel, the maid carrying neatly folded linens, the violinist whose case smelled faintly of resin, the pair of schoolchildren whispering secrets behind mittened hands, the woman with the basket of flowers in spring, the elderly lady who boarded only on Wednesdays with a jar of milk tied with string. None of them ever spoke to him, but their movements became so familiar that he could sense them long before he saw them. The sound of approaching footsteps on cobblestones often told him exactly who was coming. Quick light taps meant the schoolchildren. Slow, uneven taps meant the old man. Soft, gliding footsteps belonged to the seamstress. Heavy, wet ones were the fishermen returning home at dusk. Sometimes, when the tram was particularly quiet, Alva found himself wondering about their lives beyond the rails. He imagined the seamstress sitting in a small room with a wooden table, mending sleeves by lamplight. He pictured the factory workers sharing bread in silence during their midday break. He saw the baker's boy sweeping flour from the shop floor after hours, shoulders tired but eyes bright. These imaginings brought a kind of warmth to his thoughts, even though he knew he would never learn the truth. The regular passengers aged slowly before his eyes. A child grew taller, scarves wrapped differently, school bags changed shape. The seamstress's hair gained more silver threads. The old man's steps became smaller, his grip on the railing tighter. The fisherman's shoulders rounded a little more each year. The city's time moved through them, and Alvar, seated at the controls, became a silent witness to these transformations. He tracked the seasons of their lives the same way he tracked the seasons of the tram rails, through sound, posture, breath, presence. There were also the absences. He noticed when someone stopped appearing, not with alarm, but with a faint ache. The human rhythm of the tram shifted when a regular vanished. The empty seat in the seamstress's usual spot seemed to hold a shadow of her. The missing weight on the bench near the lantern changed the distribution of warmth. When one of the factory workers did not board, the remaining man's silence felt heavier. Sometimes, after weeks, a familiar face returned, weathered, changed, carrying some invisible story. Other times, the seats remained empty forever, the morning routine adjusting around the absence with slow acceptance. Alvar never asked questions. He never sought explanations. The tram was a place of passage, not of answers. People entered, shared a small portion of the journey, and stepped back into their own lives, carrying their mysteries with them. But these fleeting intersections shaped him more deeply than he understood. Their quiet presence softened the edges of his days, anchoring him in the steady pulse of the city. The regular passengers taught him something no training manual could: how to sense life in its smallest expressions. They showed him that meaning often lived not in grand gestures, but in consistent, almost invisible patterns. A hand resting on the same rail every morning, a scarf adjusted with the same motion, a sleeping child leaning at the same angle against the window. These details were too subtle for most people to notice, but Alvar held them with care, letting them gather inside him like small, glowing stones. Through these familiar figures, he saw the city more clearly. They were the threads that stitched Tallinn together across seasons, across years. Without them, the tram would have been only wood and metal. With them, it became a vessel carrying dozens of quiet stories, each one a small reminder that a city's soul is shaped not by its landmarks, but by its people. And Alvar, day after day, guided these stories along the rails, steady, attentive, unseen, grateful for the company of lives that touched his own without ever needing to speak. Not all passengers belonged to the familiar rhythm of Alvar's days. Some appeared only once, brief flickers of life that stepped onto the tram like small gusts of weather, shifting the air for a moment before disappearing into the city forever. They did not return, and he never expected them to. Yet their presence left a different kind of imprint, one that lingered not through repetition, but through the strange intensity of the unfamiliar. These passengers arrived without warning. Their steps carried a tone he didn't recognize: the hurried tap of an outsider, the uneasy shuffle of someone searching for direction, the hesitant approach of a visitor unsure of how the tram's door worked. They broke the usual cadence of the morning, and Alvar felt their difference before he even saw their faces. There was the young woman who boarded in the rain, her coat soaked through, raindrops gathering on her lashes. She sat only for a single ride, staring out the window as if trying to memorize the shape of the passing buildings. The water dripping from her sleeves left faint marks on the wooden floorboards, temporary stains that vanished by the next morning, though the image of her hunched silhouette remained with Alva whenever storms rolled across the harbour months later. There was a travelling merchant whose satchel clinked with small metal pieces as he moved. His boots left traces of mud from some distant place beyond the city's edge. He navigated the tram with confident steps that suggested he had seen many cities, many streets, many rails. He stayed on board for only a few stops. When he disembarked near the market, he blended quickly into the crowd. Alva sometimes wondered whether he continued his journey across other rails in other cities, carrying his satchel of tools and unfamiliar smells with him. There were sailors occasionally, men with weathered skin, wind-chapped cheeks, and eyes that seemed accustomed to distant horizons. They boarded the tram with a kind of quiet astonishment, as though the steady movement of rails felt strange after weeks or months of rocking waves. Some held tightly to the brass handles, anchoring themselves against the steady ground. Their presence tugged the scent of the sea into the carriage, and when they left, that smell dissipated slowly, like a tide retreating from shore. Children appeared sometimes too, ones he did not recognize from the regular routes. They always carried an unpredictable energy, shifting from seat to seat, pressing their noses to windows, pointing at horses or chimneys as though discovering Talon for the first time. Their questions, though unspoken, filled the space around them. What is that? Where does this go? Why does the world look different from here? Their curiosity lingered in Alva's mind long after they had vanished back into the city, holding hands with parents he never saw again. There were travellers from rural villages, carrying woolen bags tied with rope, coats smelling of smoke from wood stoves. They watched the city with wide, cautious eyes, as though its buildings were too tall, its streets too loud, its pace too swift. They boarded timidly, choosing seats near the door, hands clasped in their laps. Their silence held a different weight, not the comfortable quiet of locals, but the careful stillness of people trying not to draw notice. When they stepped off near the market or the church, Alva could sense their relief at returning to open spaces. Sometimes there were men in suits, not the common clerks of Tallinn, but travellers passing through. Their clothing was sharper, their shoes polished, their movements brisk. They carried newspapers from other regions, bearing headlines that felt distant from Alvar's daily world. Their presence added an unusual scent to the tram: ink, tobacco, and unfamiliar cologne. They boarded, rode, and departed with a finality that suggested they would never return to this route again. He remembered an elderly woman once, a stranger whose hands trembled as she climbed aboard. Her coat was old but neat, her hair pinned carefully, her eyes filled with something difficult to name. She held a small paper parcel the entire ride, her fingers curled tightly around it. When she stepped off near the church, her silhouette lingered in Alvar's thoughts for days. Something about the way she walked, slow, deliberate, a little unsteady, made him wonder whether she had taken the tram as part of a final farewell to the city or someone in it. There were also rare moments when soldiers appeared on the tram. Their posture was unmistakable, rigid backs, alert eyes, uniforms pressed clean. They boarded with an air of quiet urgency, boots heavy on the wooden steps. Their presence carried a tension that shifted the atmosphere inside the carriage. Other passengers sat more still, sensing the gravity of these figures who were only passing through. When the soldiers stepped off, the tram seemed to exhale, the wooden frame settling back into its ordinary rhythm. Alvar never knew the stories behind these one-time passengers, yet he imagined them often. He pictured where they might be headed: a new job, a farewell meeting, a distant relative's home, or simply a wrong turn that led them onto Tram 12 by accident. He wondered whether they remembered the ride later, whether the tram became part of their memories, or whether it dissolved into the blur of countless other movements. He understood that these brief encounters carried a peculiar beauty. They reminded him of the vast web of lives passing through the city, intersecting for moments before diverging again. The regular passengers were like the steady notes of a familiar song, but the one-time riders added unexpected harmonies, subtle shifts in tone that made the days feel less predictable. These fleeting presences also taught him something about his own life, that even those who visited only once left small imprints. A scarf's colour remembered days later, the shape of a traveller's hat, the way a stranger tapped their foot nervously during the ride, the lingering scent of wet wool after a rainstorm. These details accumulated, forming a quiet archive in his mind, an unspoken record of anonymous journeys. He realized that much of life was made of such passing encounters. People crossed paths without knowing how they altered each other, even in the smallest ways. And though Alvar never exchanged words with these strangers, their brief appearance along his route offered glimpses into the vastness beyond the rails. Villages, harbours, distant cities, unknown stories. Sometimes, when the tram rattled through a particularly empty stretch, or when dawn cast its first light across the windows, he thought of these forgotten faces. Not with longing, but with a gentle recognition that the world was larger than the narrow wooden cabin he guided each day. Their appearance reminded him that he was part of something wider, an ongoing flow of people and destinations he would never see but could momentarily feel. In these small intersections, he sensed the quiet truth of his work, that the tram was more than transportation. It was a meeting place for countless lifetimes, each passing through briefly before continuing on its own path. And he, sitting at the controls, was not just a driver, but a witness to the endless weave of human movement. The one-time passengers came and went. Their shadows dissolved, their footsteps faded, yet each left a faint ripple in the silent pool of Alvar's memory. He carried those ripples gently, letting them become part of the soft, ever-changing rhythm of Tram 12. The depot at the edge of Tallinn was unlike any other place in the city. During the day, it looked almost abandoned, with its soot-darkened brick walls and sagging roof lines. Children passing by sometimes pointed at its cracked windows or the stacks of worn wooden planks leaning against its doors. But at night, when the trams returned from their routes and the city settled into its evening hush, the depot revealed a different character, one that only drivers and mechanics ever saw. For Alvar, it was a sanctuary, a quiet refuge where the heartbeat of the rails slowed into something steady and familiar. After his final route of the day, when the last passengers had stepped off and the doors had closed behind them with a tired sigh, he guided Tram 12 down the long stretch of track leading into the depot yard. The light inside the cabin dimmed as it passed beneath the first shadow of the roof. The tram's wheels clicked softly over uneven rails, echoing faintly under the wide ceiling. This sound, gentle and hollow, marked the end of each day for him. It carried a subtle finality that he found comforting. The depot smelled of old oil, warm metal, and the faint sweetness of dust that had gathered in corners untouched for years. Lanterns hung from metal hooks along the walls, their flames casting trembling reflections across the polished surfaces of the trams. Some lanterns flickered restlessly, their glass smudged by soot. Others burned steadily, forming warm islands of light in the cavernous space. The shadows they cast shifted slowly as the night deepened, stretching across the floor like long, resting limbs. He passed rows of trams lined up neatly, each one with its own history etched into the wood and metal of its frame. Some trams bore scars of heavy use, gouges in the railings, worn-down steps, cracked windows patched with resin. Others, newer and brighter, stood with a sort of youthful confidence, their paint still crisp and their wheels shining. But none drew his eye like Tram 12. It always seemed to settle into its place with a certain ease, as though relieved to return to a familiar corner. After stopping the tram in its assigned slot, Alvar performed his closing tasks with the same deliberate care he brought to the beginning of each day. He shut off the controls, secured the brake lever, and dimmed the lantern in the cabin. When he stepped out, the wooden platform groaned softly beneath his weight, a sound that had long become part of the depot's night music. Mechanics moved quietly through the building, their tools clinking faintly against their belts. They rarely spoke, relying instead on gestures and nods to communicate. Their hands moved with practiced precision, tightening bolts, wiping grease from joints, inspecting wheels for wear. Alvar watched them sometimes, appreciating their craftsmanship. They tended to the trams as one would tend to aging horses, gentle, attentive, deeply aware of each machine's personality. Occasionally, a mechanic would slide beneath Tram 12, disappearing into the dimness below. The light from his lantern would flicker between the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The sound of metal being tapped, tightened or realigned became part of the depot's nighttime rhythm. Alvar found reassurance in these small noises, knowing that someone else cared for the machine he had guided through so many long days. There were moments when the depot felt almost alive. The trams seemed to breathe as they cooled, their wooden panels shifting with soft pops and sighs. The rails hummed faintly, releasing the tension of the day's travel. Overhead, wires swayed slightly in the draft that moved through the building, brushing against metal hooks with a quiet rattle. These sounds formed a kind of lullaby, a mechanical whisper that settled into Alvar's bones. He often lingered after his shift, long after other drivers had returned to their homes. He walked slowly between the rows of resting trams, his steps soft on the dust-covered floor. He observed the details others rushed past, the worn edges of wooden benches, the scratches left by passengers' boots, the fading paint on exterior panels. These marks told the unspoken stories of countless journeys, work commutes, market trips, hurried errands, quiet moments shared between strangers. Tram 12, in particular, held layers of memory he felt almost able to touch. He raised his hand along its side sometimes, letting his fingertips glide over the wood grain, feeling the warmth still lingering from the day's work. The tram's body no longer felt cold at night. Instead, it held a deep warmth, like a creature settling into rest. He knew every notch in the frame, every spot where the paint had thinned, every minor imperfection that made the machine uniquely itself. There were nights when the depot lights dimmed early due to power rationing. On those evenings, shadows gathered more thickly, and the lanterns seemed to glow deeper, their flames slow and golden. The depot became a world of silhouettes and quiet halos of light. Alvar found himself drawn to these moments. They reminded him of being inside a vast, echoing cathedral, made not of stone, but of iron and timber. During winter, the air inside the depot grew sharp and metallic, carrying the bite of frost from the outside tracks. Workers wore gloves even indoors, and their breath fogged faintly as they moved between tasks. Trams arrived coated in thin layers of frost, their wheels cracking the ice on the rails as they rolled into position. The cold amplified every sound, making even the softest creak resonate through the building. In summer, the depot grew warm, filled with the scent of heated wood and oil. Doors remained open longer to let in breezes from the harbour. Dust shifted lazily in the sunbeams that filtered through gaps in the ceiling. Insects sometimes drifted in, orbiting the lanterns with aimless persistence. The atmosphere felt lighter then, almost drowsy, and the trams seemed to settle into sleep more slowly. Alvar's favourite moment came just before he left for the night. After the mechanics finished their checks and the depot quieted once more, he returned to Tram 12 for one last look. He stepped inside, feeling the subtle warmth of the wooden floorboards beneath his boots. The interior always held a lingering scent of the day: bread from the baker's boy, damp wool from factory workers' coats, the faint floral trace from someone's scarf. These smells layered together into a single, gentle perfume that belonged to no one and everyone. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting his hands rest loosely on his lap. The lantern's glow from outside cast long slivers of light across the controls. He closed his eyes, breathing in the stillness, allowing the memories of the day's routes to settle. The steady hum of the depot enveloped him, the quiet shifting of metal, the distant murmur of mechanics preparing to leave, the low whistle of the wind slipping through a crack in the roof. When he finally rose and stepped out of the tram, he did so with a kind of reverence. He placed his hand briefly on the doorframe, a silent acknowledgement of another day completed. As he walked toward the exit, the depot slowly receded behind him, its faint glow dimming until it blended into the night. Outside, the city felt different. The air was freer, colder, touched by the distant sounds of nighttime Tallinn. But the weight and warmth of the depot lingered within him. It was a place where the world slowed, where machines slept, where the noise of life softened into something manageable and kind. To others, the depot was just a workplace, quiet, dusty, unremarkable. To Alvar, it was a second home, a place that held his days, his routines, and his quiet devotion, a place where he belonged as surely as Tram 12 did. And every night, as he walked away, he carried with him the soft echo of resting wheels and the gentle breath of a city's oldest machines. When the depot finally fell quiet and the mechanics extinguished the lanterns one by one, Alvar stepped outside and allowed the chill of the evening to fold around him. The world beyond the depot always felt strangely softer, as if the city exhaled at night, loosening the tightness it carried during the day. The street lamps cast pale halos across the cobblestones, their light trembling slightly in the breeze blowing in from the harbour. The air smelled of damp stone, distant smoke, and the faint tang of salt drifting inland with the wind. Alvar began his walk home at a pace unhurried, letting each step ground him after the long hours spent guiding a machine along steel rails. His feet always felt slightly heavier during this transition, as though the motion of the tram still lingered in his bones. The rhythmic sway of the carriage, the steady hum beneath the floorboards, and the rail's subtle vibrations stayed with him long after he had stepped away from the controls. The silence of the evening made these remnants more noticeable, turning them into a quiet echo that accompanied him along the street. Tallinn at night had a way of shrinking. Buildings that looked imposing in daylight receded into shadow, their windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Narrow alleys softened, their edges blurred by the dim light. The city's noises shifted into a gentler register. The clack of a distant carriage, the murmur of late-night conversations behind shuttered windows, the occasional bark of a dog from a neighboring courtyard. These sounds wrapped themselves around him with comforting familiarity. He had heard them every evening for years, and they marked the slow unwinding of the day. He often passed by the bakery that supplied half of the old town with bread. By this hour, the ovens had cooled, but the scent of flour and yeast still hovered in the air like a fading memory of warmth. He sometimes slowed as he walked by, not to look inside, but simply to breathe in the last traces of the morning's work. It reminded him of the baker's boy who rode tram 12 each dawn, his basket full and steaming. Even at night, the association remained strong, forming a small thread that connected his evening walk back to the early hours of the day. Further along the street, lanterns flickered in the windows of taverns where labourers ended their long shifts. Their laughter drifted into the night, uneven, rough, softened by fatigue and drink. Alvar rarely looked inside. He preferred the solitude of the street to the crowded warmth of those rooms. Still, the sound brought a kind of reassurance. It told him that the city kept its rituals, that even as the world changed outside Tallinn's borders, some things remained steady. Laughter, work, hunger, fatigue. These were constants he had observed in his passengers every day. He turned down a quieter lane where the houses leaned slightly inward, their rooftops meeting above to form a narrow strip of sky. Here the wind calmed, and the night became still enough for him to hear his own footsteps clearly. The sound of leather on cobblestone echoed off the close walls, forming a slow, steady cadence that matched the unhurried rhythm of his breathing. This part of the walk always felt like stepping into a small pocket of time suspended from the rest of the city. The world outside seemed distant, as though he were walking through a memory rather than a real street. Sometimes a cat emerged from behind a doorway, its eyes glinting in the dim light. It moved with silent purpose, crossing the path and disappearing beneath a fence. Other nights, the faint glow of a candle flickered behind a cracked shutter, revealing someone still awake, perhaps mending clothes, writing a letter, or simply sitting in thought. These glimpses of private life reminded him of the passengers he carried each day, people whose stories he knew only through posture, gesture, scent, and routine. The walk home deepened this sense of quiet observation, offering new silhouettes and anonymous moments to store alongside the countless others. As he approached his own street, the city grew even quieter. His neighborhood was tucked near the edge of the old town, close enough to feel its pulse, but distant enough to escape the late-night noise. The houses here were modest, their paint weathered by salt winds blowing in from the sea. Wooden fences lined the street in uneven rows, some leaning forward as though eager to greet passers-by. Others slanted back in resignation. Grass pushed through cracks in the walkway, swaying gently in the evening draught. Alvar's home stood among these buildings, a narrow structure with a slanted roof and a small porch. The shutters creaked faintly in the wind, as they always did. The front step bore the marks of long use, its wood smoothed by decades of soles. Lamps from neighbouring houses cast soft yellow reflections across its surface, giving the entrance a quiet warmth. He felt a familiar heaviness lift slightly whenever he saw the porch waiting for him, as though his day settled into its final rightful place in the world. Inside, the rooms were small and sparse, but they held a sense of deliberate calm. The scent of soap and old wood lingered in the air. He lit a single lamp, setting it on the table near the window. The flame glowed with a soft steadiness, illuminating the edges of his modest possessions. The enamel bowl on the shelf, the worn-out chair with its frayed cushion, the folded blanket resting neatly on his bed. Each object carried the simple honesty of a life lived without excess. He removed his coat and hung it carefully on the hook near the door. His hands felt slightly numb from the cool night air, and he rubbed them together slowly before warming them near the lantern. The day's fatigue seeped through his limbs, not as a burden, but as a gentle reminder of hours well spent. The physical tiredness was familiar, predictable, and almost comforting. It meant the tram had moved as it should, that he had fulfilled his part in the quiet rhythm of the city. Sometimes he prepared a small meal, bread, a bit of cheese, perhaps a boiled potato if he had taken the time earlier to cook. Other nights, he skipped dinner entirely, preferring tea and the silence that accompanied it. He sat by the window, cup warming his hands, while the shadows of passing clouds drifted slowly across the street outside. The dim lamplight filtered through the glass, casting faint reflections on the floorboards. In those reflections, he often saw the shape of the tram's lantern, as though the workday still lingered with him even in rest. Thoughts came to him gradually, like leaves settling on still water. He considered the faces he had seen that day, the regulars whose presence shaped his mornings, the strangers whose brief appearance added unexpected colour to his route. He replayed certain sounds in his mind, the tap of boots on the tram's steps, the rustle of coats, the low hum of the rails beneath the wheels. These memories did not trouble him. Instead, they formed a quiet tapestry of moments that filled the space within him with a sense of purpose. When he finally lay down on his narrow bed, he listened to the faint creaks of the house settling into the night. Outside, the wind brushed against the shutter, producing a soft, rhythmic tapping. He found comfort in these sounds, just as he found comfort in the hum of Tram 12 or the muffled noises of the depot. They reminded him that the world continued to move around him, even as sleep approached. The street grew still, its last voices fading. The city's lanterns dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the moon reflected on rooftops. Alvar's eyes grew heavy, the day slipping away in quiet fragments. And in the final breath before sleep, he felt the gentle echo of the rails once more, steady, soothing, familiar. It was the sound of a life lived in motion, returning each night to rest. Years moved quietly through the streets of Tallinn, settling into corners the way dust settles on old wooden beams. Buildings changed their colours, trees grew taller, tracks were repaired and relaid, and new faces appeared on the tram benches, while others disappeared without a trace. Through all these slow transformations, Alvar continued his steady passage along the rails, guiding Tram 12 through fog, snow, heat, and the subtle shifts of seasons that shaped the city in ways most people barely noticed. Time brushed against him gently, altering him the same way it altered the trams he drove, softening edges, deepening lines, polishing surfaces through repetition. He grew older, not suddenly, but in small, almost invisible increments. His steps became more deliberate. His hands, once firm and precise, carried a slight tremor he felt only in the quiet hours of the morning. His eyes, still attentive, took longer to adjust to the light when he first lit the cabin lantern. Yet none of these changes disrupted the rhythm he had cultivated over decades. Each day he rose, walked the familiar streets, and took his place behind the controls of Tram 12, as though time itself paused for him during those early hours. Tallinn, too, aged around him. New buildings rose where empty lots once stood. The cobblestones near the market were replaced with smoother stones that clicked differently under the tram wheels. Overhead, wires were strengthened, reshaped, and extended along newly built routes. The city's heartbeat remained, but its cadence shifted subtly, in the same way a familiar melody changes when played on a newer instrument. Tram 12 bore the marks of this passage more visibly. Its paint faded into a softer hue. Its wooden panels wore down in places touched by countless hands, and its wheels carried grooves polished by decades of friction against the rails. Mechanics tended to it with increasing frequency, tightening bolts that had loosened with age and oiling joints that grew stiff during winter. They spoke of newer models arriving soon, sleeker carriages with smoother frames, brighter interiors, and improved controls. These innovations carried a promise of efficiency, yet they lacked the quiet character that had defined the older trams. Alvar took this news without resistance. He had never clung to the notion that things must remain unchanged. He believed that everything, machines, cities, people, held their own seasons, each with purpose and dignity. If a time came when Tram 12 no longer ran, he knew it would not be a loss, but the natural conclusion of a long, honest life of work. Still, he felt a gentle ache at the thought of retiring the tram, the way one might feel when folding away an old coat that had warmed countless winters. As the city modernized, new drivers arrived at the depot. Young men with confident strides, their training quick and efficient, eager to take their place on the rails. They greeted Alvar respectfully, though their eyes carried a hint of curiosity, wondering how someone could spend so many decades guiding the same machine along the same routes without losing interest. They asked him questions sometimes, but he offered only quiet advice about the subtleties of listening, how to sense a wheel's hesitation on wet rails, how to notice the faint change in pitch when overhead wires grew tense in cold weather, how to read the city through the movements of passengers. One day, during a particularly cold winter, Alvar arrived at the depot to find Tram 12 standing in its usual place, the lantern casting a soft halo across its worn wooden frame. Yet something felt different. The air in the cabin carried a deeper chill. The boards beneath his feet shifted a little more sharply, and the rails hummed with a tone slightly hoarser than usual. He guided the tram out as always, but he sensed a quiet fatigue in the way it moved, a heaviness that came not from any visible flaw, but from the long accumulation of years. The mechanics confirmed his suspicion that evening. Tram 12, though still functional, had reached an age where repairs no longer lasted. The frame had begun to loosen in ways difficult to fix, and the internal mechanisms required parts no longer manufactured. The tram could continue for a time, they said, but its days were becoming finite. Alvar accepted the news with the same calm he brought to every aspect of life. He continued driving Tram 12 for as long as it remained safe, cherishing each day without sentimentality. He listened carefully to its every sound, memorizing the creaks and hums as though they were fragments of a familiar lullaby. Even as the tram's strength waned, its character remained intact. It moved with dignity, its wheels carrying the weight of countless journeys with steady grace. Then, one spring morning, the depot announced that Tram 12 would be retired at the end of the week. A newer model would take its place on the route. The news spread quietly among the drivers, though most of them had never driven the old tram and felt no deep attachment. To them, it was simply an old machine moving aside for a newer one. For Alvar, however, the final week carried a soft, unmistakable significance. Passengers boarded as usual, unaware that they were stepping onto the tram for the last time. The regulars took their familiar seats, the strangers drifted in and out, and the rhythm of the city continued without pause. Yet to Alvar, each moment felt slightly suspended, as though time had slowed around him to observe the end of something meaningful. On the final evening, as he guided Tram 12 back into the depot, the sun dipped low over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the rails. The cabin filled with warm, amber light that softened the lines of the worn wooden interior. He completed the final shutdown with steady hands, allowing the routine to carry him through the moment. When he stepped out, he placed his hand on the door frame a little longer than usual, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath his palm. The tram seemed to settle gently, its last breath slipping quietly into the stillness of the depot. The mechanics rolled it to a quiet corner of the building, away from the newer trams. It would not be dismantled immediately. Such decisions took time. For now, it rested in the soft glow of lantern light, its paint catching the warm reflections like a memory preserved. In the days that followed, Alvar adjusted to the new tram assigned to him. It moved more smoothly, responded more sharply, and produced fewer of the soft, familiar sounds he had grown accustomed to. Yet, he drove it with the same care, the same attention, the same quiet devotion. His life had been shaped by the rails, not by a single machine, and he continued along them with steady purpose. Still, he passed by the resting place of Tram 12 each evening before heading home. He walked slowly between the rows, listening to the muted echoes of the depot settling into night. When he reached the old tram, he paused for a moment, letting his gaze rest on its quiet silhouette. He felt no sorrow, only gratitude. The machine had carried him through decades, offering him a place within the flowing rhythm of the city, allowing him to witness the small, beautiful stories of countless lives. And as he finally stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt the city moving gently around him. The distant hum of new trams, the whisper of the harbour wind, the rustle of leaves along the street, all part of a world that continued, changed, and yet somehow remained the same. For a man who had spent his life guiding others along their paths, there was comfort in knowing that the rails would always stretch ahead, shining faintly under the moon, inviting him to follow their quiet, unending line.